Ladies and gentlemen, Larry the Lizard. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for world discussion with Agent Smith. The world is a bit on fire, and we're gonna just talk about stuff and try to break it down for you all. Usual preface for this is that we don't know everything that we talk about, and we're just trying our best to understand what's going on. This is a conversation, not a gospel words. If you have corrections or input, either in the Twitch chat or in the YouTube comments, we welcome your feedback. I'm going to jump into chat here, and we're going to begin the next world discussion with Agent Smith. Agent Smith.
Hello?
Hello?
Hey, how are you?
You know what? I'm hanging in there. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing okay.
Yep.
Just trying to keep track of all the things.
Yep. So, was this a slow week for the news?
Other than the one big thing, maybe. I haven't noticed as much going on, but then that's because everybody's kind of focused on reporting events in Ukraine.
Yeah, and everyone also has pressure applied to them to sort of pick a side and see what they can do about it.
Yeah.
So, quick update. For those who missed it, Bitter Sugar, last Agent Smith, at the end of the segment, came on for a voice conversation. He is a friend of the stream who is currently in Kyiv, and I'm happy to report that he is still surviving. He's in one piece. His wife is there. They're okay. So, anyone who is worried about that, we've been getting some updates from him in Discord and Twitch chat. He's in good shape, and he has to because he's going to coach me some Dota. So when this is all said and done, maybe we'll just have some chill Dota streams and catch up, and he can share some stories and stuff.
There you go.
If you use the Ukraine command in the chat, you can see a YouTube video which is just the interview, and the audio quality was kind of scuffed because he was on his phone and not his computer. So we got some subtitles, which Cobra X helped us out with. The full Agent Smith episode is a separate upload, which is also on YouTube.
Be good to have him on and get that first-person perspective.
Yeah, if we've learned anything with all of this, it's that there's a great deal of propaganda and misinformation floating around, but people who are there can kind of just look and see what's happening, and that cuts through a lot of the garbage. So big ups to Bitter Sugar for that.
Yeah, maybe that was insightful for any Russians that might have been listening. I understand that the government over there is inhibiting reporting on what's going on to a pretty significant degree.
Yeah, I did
More
look
so.
into a little bit of that too, where there are two sides to this, where the Ukrainian people are obviously heavily pressured by being actively invaded and shot at, and then the Russian people are dealing with their own struggles with heavy censorship of what they can and cannot talk about. I've seen like posts advising people to just clean up their social media accounts. Like if you said anything critical of the government at all, you can be investigated and put in prison or fined for just saying that you don't approve of it. So anyone who is doing that is doing it at a pretty major risk to themselves. And then you have all of the different economic pressures that are being applied to Russia, and the citizens have to shoulder a lot of the brunt of that. So it's kind of an indirect way of putting pressure on the administration. Like they're going to still have money at the top for a while, but the average people are having their currency devalued dramatically, and it's just a really tough time.
Yeah, everybody's getting it. We'll see how long it lasts, but for now it looks like it's going to go for the foreseeable future.
But you did talk about sanctions kind of leading up to this whole thing as an option that was on the table that wasn't direct military engagement, and pretty much everybody has been favoring either providing aid to Ukraine or putting sanctions on Russia instead of putting their own troops on the ground with their own flag and that kind of a thing to avoid a multinational conflict if they can.
What was that last bit?
They're applying sanctions and providing aid and like military equipment instead of putting their own troops on the ground with their own flag so that they don't have a multinational conflict, and it's
Yeah.
mostly Ukraine versus Russia.
Yeah, there have been volunteers coming in. I think the Ukrainian government said that they'd had 20,000 applications from foreigners who want to volunteer and help fight. So there is some interest there, but yeah, for the most part, it's Ukrainians versus the Russian army, as you say.
And they're not letting just anyone sign up to fight. You have to have some military training or background. And then even for Ukrainian citizens, they're not letting anyone just join in the fray because they want to be pretty organized and serious about who they put into those slots. That it kind of ties into the bigger picture distinction between civilians and military personnel, and how when you're in active war, they're a lot more likely to shoot at you if you are a military personnel than if you're a civilian. There have been reports that civilians are still getting shot at and shelled and bombed and so on, but there are those videos too where you see some Russian military by a tank, and we saw it in the last episode. There are Ukrainian people who are kind of shouting at them, and they're not getting shot at because they don't currently have weapons. So you get treated differently depending on whether you have weapons or not. So they want to be pretty careful about who they send into the fray with weapons and their designated military.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. True. I guess this is kind of another thing that we were discussing a little bit, which was secrecy is a big part of war. And if it's in the news, there are going to be some other secrets of what they're trying to do. Because you don't want to put all of your military strategies on Facebook. That's not very secure. You want to have some tricks up your sleeve. You want to have some pieces in play that the opponent doesn't know about. So we're obviously, just as people browsing the news and trying to figure out what's going on, we're not going to see the whole picture. And that's just going to be a fact of the entire conflict.
Gosh. I'm still. There's so much stuff to get through. Can't even process all of it. Yeah, I don't know entirely what the Russians are planning as far as what they're going to do with cities. Obviously, they're taking the view that they're centers of resistance, and so they're legitimate targets, and so they're laying into them with ranged fires, mostly artillery and Grad rocket fire, and some airstrikes as well, if not also maybe some cruise missiles. They don't seem to have as many of those, so we haven't been hearing about them very much. But yeah, it's pretty rough. Kharkiv is getting it pretty badly. I don't think maybe Sumy, and then Mariupol is definitely getting hammered right now as well. And I suspect Kiev is going to be next. I know some of the suburbs to the north, like Irpin, are really getting hammered hard, but sooner or later the Russians are probably going to surround the city, and so that'll be the next battle, if not the biggest battle.
I did hear from Bitter Sugar that the raids where they get bombed and stuff happen at nighttime as opposed to during the day.
Yeah.
Why is that? They're less likely to get shot by anti-air or something?
Um, it's a trick. Yeah, basically that's it. Basically it's to mitigate the likelihood of getting shot down by like some dude with a Stinger missile or some such. But it kind of is part of a broader question of why the Russian Air Force has not been more active. And we still don't entirely know the reason for that, but as evidence is kind of piling up now as the conflict continues and escalates, that the Russians may not have the organizational capacity to organize and basically do large formation operations. Right now they're just sending in like single aircraft or aircraft in pairs but they're not really flying multiple types of aircraft in larger formations at the same time. And there's some speculation that maybe they were just taking it easy because they didn't want to do too much damage to civilians or other infrastructure, or maybe they were just trying to save valuable assets in order to ensure they didn't get shot down. But as the conflict continues to go and as losses mount up and it becomes more apparent that the Russians are really committing to the war, these explanations kind of make less and less sense. And so experts that I've been reading online are kind of struggling to make sense out of the decision not to commit large numbers of Russian aircraft. And it seems that consensus is coalescing around the idea that maybe they just don't really know how,
Mm-hmm.
or at least don't know how to do it beyond a very limited operational capacity. So that's also part of the picture there. They're not just attacking at night because it's safer. They're attacking at night because there's not really any other viable option for them. Given their inability to suppress Ukrainian air defenses, that's just sort of the logical conclusion then. That's the logical outcome of that, rather.
I guess this ties into a question that I already saw in the chat from Broken Helix, which was the potential deal with planes. We talked a little bit about the difference between like Soviet aircraft and U.S. aircraft, and I think the deal on the table, correct me if I'm wrong, is U.S. proposes we trade F-16s or some, not the newest model, but a slightly older model of plane to Poland or some other NATO country that's nearby, and they trade some more familiar aircraft to Ukraine because it takes a while to figure out how to fly a certain kind of plane. They have different console, they handle differently, all that. You don't want to send people in with a car they don't know how to drive, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's not as simple as just taking a pilot and sticking him in the cockpit. You do have to have plane-specific training. And, even if it's the same type of plane, like even if it's a MiG-29, which the Ukrainians operate, the type of MiG-29s that the Poles have, for example, are different. They have different avionics. And you have to familiarize, what's the word I want? Ukrainian pilots would have to get familiar with the differences between Polish MiG-29s and Ukrainian MiG-29s. And that just inherently takes time,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it'll probably be a while. Yeah, there's been drama over that because the Ukrainian government came out and announced that a deal was finalized and that the planes were already on their way. And I remember reading before we did this last week that the planes were on their way, that the Europeans were flying them, to the border with Ukraine. So I was expecting that to kind of happen, but then sort of at the last minute, I guess it was reported that there had been no deal finalized. So the Ukrainians were either misinformed, or they were jumping the gun, or they were trying to make a public release in order to try to pressure Eastern European governments into doing that. Which is the case is anybody's guess. I don't know. But regardless, for a while, it looked like the deal had fallen through. But in reality, it just was still in the works. They were still trying to kind of work out just the specifics of how it would work. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be an F-16s for MiGs deal, basically. The United States is going to replace the aircraft that Poland, specifically, maybe also other nations, but Poland is the one I read about. The United States is going to replace all of the MiGs that Poland donates with F-16s.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be the trade-off. So those MiG-29s are on their way to Ukraine. I just don't know when exactly they'll be handed over, or when Ukrainian pilots will be sufficiently familiar with the aircraft in order to start flying them. But that does look like it's going to happen, at least for the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I saw the speech from Zelensky asking for a no-fly zone to be created for Ukraine, and there were a lot of people discussing how that's basically asking for another country to just commit their air force and also some air force support to the war, which would make it a multinational conflict by default. So that's something that I think they discussed at a NATO summit or something, and they ended up deciding not to do, just because that would be a heavy escalation, whereas this plane deal is a sort of compromise where it still helps them with their air game, but it doesn't commit soldiers and pilots from other countries into the fray.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There's just a strong aversion to taking that kind of action because of the expectation that it would inherently, well, inevitably escalate into a confrontation between NATO and Russia. And so that being the case, it's extremely unlikely and pretty much always was. Some people online, some of the more hawkish guys, were saying that the US should just donate planes and then allow quote unquote volunteer pilots to fly the planes. And then that could be a kind of de facto no-fly zone, but that isn't that isn't going to fool anybody. That's Russia's just going to interpret that as a de facto
That's
no-fly
what they
zone
did
like
in
it does.
Crimea, though.
It's what they
Well,
did in Crimea. It's what China did in the Korean War, so it's not unheard of. But yeah, it's probably not going to result in a different outcome than if you just did an outright no-fly zone.
I don't know who these troops are. Their uniforms don't really have any symbols on them.
Yeah, there's some demand for it because people just hate kind of watching things play out without seemingly doing anything. So I suspect as the conflict drags out, there's going to be more public pressure for more proactive action on the part of the West, on the part of the United States and Europe. But, options as far as direct action are going to be very limited. And, as far as nonviolent action, nonviolent support, and indirect action, we're already doing a lot. We've got, it's more or less been confirmed that we're sharing information from E3 Centuries. We talked a little bit about that last time. So we've got them flying along the border and we're conveying that information to the Ukrainians. And from what I read, the United States is using all of its intelligence assets in order to try to get up to the minute information as to Russian troop movements in Ukraine. And from what I read, the Ukrainian government is getting that information something like as little as an hour after it's been gathered, which is a very quick turnaround. So the Ukrainians are definitely beneficiaries here of some very proficient and very fast intelligence sharing and gathering. And then there's also all of the weapons that are being shared. I think I think there was a little bit of a snafu with the Stinger missiles because the government said early on, or at least government officials said early on, that we were going to share Stinger missiles. But then the government came out and said, actually, we're not going to do that. But then there were some other guys that were talking about, oh, yeah, we just sent a shipment the other day. So I don't think the government quite knows what it's doing there. I think there seems to be some miscommunication. But suffice to say, the United States is definitely sending anti-tank missiles, guns, ammunition, and various other forms of equipment in great numbers, and probably at an increasing rate. At first, I think it was something like a couple $100 million that had been set aside for aid to Ukraine. But I read this past week that the amount that's going to be set aside for the future is going to be something like $10 billion. So no small amount. So there's probably also going to be financial support. I don't know what form that's going to take, if it's going to be like loans or grants or what have you, but the Ukrainian government is invariably going to need help with money. So that's probably going to be in the cards if it isn't happening already. Gosh, what else? Intelligence, weapons. I think those are sort of the main things right now. I know that also that President Zelensky himself was given a satellite phone so that contact could be maintained with him. So even if Kiev gets surrounded, we'll probably still hear from him, or at least the government will. I don't know if he'll have quite so many public releases, but yeah, contact will be maintained in that vein. Yeah, I think those are all the forms of support I can think of off the top of my head. That might be a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in most of the things I talk about on here at this point. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to learn more than I want to know more than anybody. So participation in chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while I do this, but I will read it later.
I did hear some theories too of the sort of information games between the aid that Ukraine is actually getting and the posture that Zelensky takes versus the other countries helping him. So if he's saying in his speeches that he's not getting enough help from the West, then that in a way is downplaying the engagement of NATO and the United States in this whole conflict, which that creates a certain image toward how they're responding to Russia, and then Russia's doing similar things where Moscow says this and that to try to shift the narrative a certain way and make the conflict look a certain way, which can act as a feint or create opportunities for certain surprises. Like if you really say, man, the West is not helping us at all, and then suddenly there's a plain deal, they may not have expected it as much as if you just said, hey, yay, we got our plain deal right away. So that may have potentially been done to some degree in the past a little bit, where they already had a lot of the steps moving forward, so they were ready to have those come online, and you sort of act like you're more alone than you are when maybe you do have some tricks up your sleeve or some things that you keep secret.
Yeah, I don't doubt that the West is doing things with Ukraine that it's not going to be open about. Actually, one of the things I was thinking about today is that there's been a transfer of a number of drones to Ukraine. I don't know if they bought them or if they were just given to them, but I know that they've been getting more Bayraktar drones from Turkey. And probably they've got enough pilots to fly those, I would assume. But it is technically possible for drones to be operated from vast distances. I remember the United States used to operate drones operating in Afghanistan and Iraq from a base in Louisiana on the other side of the planet. So that is possible. So if Ukraine doesn't have the pilots for their drones, hypothetically, it's possible that they could be operated remotely from a third party, or by a third party, rather. And that third party could hypothetically be the United States government or another friendly government, or perhaps more likely, quote unquote, contractors of some kind. So we could be doing that, and we probably won't be open about doing that if we are, because that could be seen as a provocation, since that technically would involve American troops directing fire against Russian troops, which
Mm.
is really towing the borderline between indirect and direct involvement. But again, that's just speculation on my part. I don't know if that's actually happening, but that's the kind of thing that could happen.
There was a second part to Helix's question about the plane deal, which was if the planes that Ukraine ends up using are launched from an airbase that's outside Ukraine, say in Poland, for example, does that have any implications about Poland's involvement? I mean, all of this is really messy anyway, and Russia would no doubt be upset if that ends up coming into play. But what are the implications? Maybe there's some law about that regarding war.
I think that gets a little into the weeds. I'm not sufficiently familiar with like the relevant laws, but certainly if you take off from an airfield in a third party country and then attack uh, ground assets belonging to a country invading, I mean, basically, it would be very problematic, at the least, if Ukrainian aircraft launched from Poland and attacked Russian ground forces. And the Russian government has already come out and said in the past couple days that it would see that as a significant escalation. So I don't think it'll happen. I don't know exactly what the consequences would be if it did, but certainly that's probably that's closer to the line than I suspect Poland and other friendly nations are going to want to get.
Mm-hmm.
So more likely the aircraft will be flown from Poland to Ukraine, or a Ukrainian airbase rather, and then will, go on to conduct whatever operations it sees fit from there. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to directly fly from Poland into combat. That would be a substantial, a substantial escalation at the very least. If they wanted to toe the line, they could just roll it over the border and then take off from there. I mean, you can get technical if you want, but yeah, I don't think flying directly into combat is in the cards.
Have you heard anything about an FSB interview?
FSB interview?
Yeah, there's a Twitter thread that Chicken Man just asked. I'll link it to you. I hadn't heard of this until just now, but FSB, I guess, is the current KGB kind of a thing.
Kind of. I know what you mean.
Oops, wrong link.
So the KGB was actually split into two different institutions, and the FSB was one of them. I don't remember what the other one was. I want to say it was the SVR, but I could be wrong. But the idea was to decentralize power. The new democratic Russia didn't want a single agency to have so many responsibilities concentrated into itself, and so they broke up the agency into different agencies so that no one agency would quite have so much capability to conduct operations just on its own. So the FSB is I wouldn't say it's what the KGB became. I would say it's one of the successor agencies to the KGB.
Hmm.
But it's generally the one that gets the most attention because they're frequently involved in counterintelligence within Russia. So whenever, journalists and foreign journalists get messed with, it's generally FSB. But I think they've also been involved in some foreign operations. I don't think that's technically in their purview, but I think I have read that. I think the polonium poisonings were done by the GRU, which I want to say is military intelligence, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see. Is it the second one?
I think the first link. It's the most recent link that I sent you, the Twitter link.
Gotcha. Let me pop that up.
Yeah, one of the things that many of us are not really familiar with, at least previously, is the relationship between air forces, ground forces, armored forces, and how you have basically counters of each of them. Like Stinger missiles countering air stuff, javelins countering tanks. And if you want any one type to be successful, you have to cover those counters by having a counter to that counter, which is something that you think about a lot in StarCraft, but there haven't been as many wars in recent history where people are reading about these different kinds of weapons that are being supplied by different countries and what they're meant to do. So it seems like Ukraine needs some help with their air game, which leads into the plane deal that's being done. And then there's the javelins that have been supplied that help a lot against the tanks. The Turkish drones help a lot against the tanks as well. And a lot of these things are pretty point and click and easy to use. I watched a YouTube video that just broke down what the javelin was and how it works, and I think it was posted a couple years ago, so pretty recently, but man, that is some pretty advanced weaponry.
Yeah, that was. Man, I miss being. I miss my armchair general days. I would know more about it. I would have read more about it. I don't think that's Cold War era tech, if I'm not mistaken.
The
And
javelin?
somebody, yeah,
The
I
javelin
want to
is
say,
relatively new.
yeah, I think that's the case.
It's an American thing, weighs about 45 pounds, just over the shoulder. It has a little sight through it that has a bunch of different indicators of how far away your target is and a bunch of other information that you might want to have. And basically you hover over it, and then whenever it beeps at you, you have a lock on more or less, and then you can shoot stuff from quite far away. It's a really strong item. Pretty expensive, obviously. A lot of these things that are advanced military tech are very expensive each, but you don't really need a ton of training with it, which means that you can just hand someone something and they can more or less figure out how to use it.
Yeah, whatever. The less training required, the better, basically, given time constraints.
Yeah.
I'm sure if they had their druthers, they would be sending more advanced equipment, but more advanced stuff than that is going to require more of a lead time that just doesn't exist right now. I might add here that from what I've been reading, Russia is still expected to win. It's still pretty early in the war at this point. I don't think it's going to be over in just 2 weeks. We have reason to believe now that the Russian plan was originally to take Ukraine in about 15 days. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen, at least as of now. So it's going to drag out a bit longer than that, at least. The Russians may keep to their original plan even if they go over that 15-day mark, but once they get up to maybe around the third week or the fourth week, then we might see some big strategic shifts in terms of how they approach the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But for now, they're probably not too far off schedule based off of the plan. The plan that we know about was basically some plans taken off of a Russian officer captured in the south, I want to say around Kherson. And just based off of that, we've gleaned some information anyway about what the overall Russian operation is supposed to look like. So they're probably not too far behind schedule at this point.
A lot of the posts make it look like the armor divisions are not very well supplied, like the logistics aren't very strong for Russia, at least from the news that I've been seeing. And again, fog of war, every side is going to basically create their own slant for morale boosting purposes. So Ukraine is going to post a lot about how we're kicking ass and victory is imminent for us, and then the Russian media is basically doing the opposite and saying we have very few casualties and we're winning super hard. So it makes it pretty tough for your average news reading person to figure out what's going on, and you're going to be pretty biased toward whatever side of the news cycle that you're reading. But it does seem, at least from my rough guess, that it's more difficult than they expected it to be, and it's not as much of a walkover victory as maybe they thought it could have been.
Yeah.
And the economic hit has been massive.
It has.
It seems hard to look at this whole conflict, and even if you're kind of arguing for the very nationalist expansionist thing, it's so expensive to throw so many people and so much equipment to take this territory when Ukraine clearly is not going to be just bullied into giving up easily.
Yeah, the logistical side of it has definitely been the focus of attention for the past week. And that's kind of what I've been reading more about in the past couple days in particular. It's a little hard to kind of interpret the Russian underperformance, logistically speaking. It could be the result of Ukrainian action, because Ukrainian special forces, as well as a homemade Ukrainian drone, has been used in order to kind of harry the Russian rear. And so that's causing problems. But whether or not that's principally responsible for the slowdown is unclear. It's probably multiple factors. One of them is the raiding. One of them is the Rasputitsa, sort of the muddy season. That's kind of forced Russian vehicles to stay on the roads instead of traveling cross-country. And that's forced them to kind of funnel their forces into relatively narrow road systems. So that makes it pretty predictable. That makes their travel relatively predictable, such that you can set up ambushes, and it also means that it's harder to send large numbers of troops because the roads can only sustain so many vehicles at once.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's trying to shoot a fire hose's worth of water through a straw. You know, you can't. And some of it, I'm sure, is due to just poor planning. I mean, there's more and more evidence that this was not something that they really fully prepared for, and that it may well have actually been an impromptu decision. There was some more evidence that came out that the operation was only really approved on February the 18th, I think. And if that's true, then they may not have had much time to really scale up for an actual invasion. So that could be partly responsible for the logistical snags too.
Yeah, and it seems like it would be hard to anticipate the amount of aid that Ukraine would get too, because if you're just looking at what does Ukraine have right now, can they invade and push that over, as opposed to as soon as we start pushing, if they get a whole bunch of reinforcements of additional troops who do have military experience and a whole bunch of equipment that may be more advanced than what they're bringing to the table, it's a lot harder battle than it looks at face value. And also just the morale edge of the Ukrainian people want to defend their home more so than conscripts want to push into it.
Yeah, exactly. The conscripts. From what I read this past week, there's actually a law in Russia that forbids conscripts from being used in war. So it's not just that they didn't expect to be fighting; they're not even supposed to be fighting. It's not even technically legal. So that's no doubt come as a major shock to them that they've been kind of thrown into this.
Mm-hmm.
But as you say, it seems it's also a shock to the Russian officers who either were not told there would be this degree of resistance or just genuinely were not expecting it. And it's not clear why. We still don't know. But yeah, as far as logistics, I did have some notes here on that. So there's a huge convoy north of Kiev that's been sort of building up. It's about 17 miles long, maybe longer. I've heard different numbers on social media, but I'm going to go with the 17-mile quote for the moment. And it hasn't actually moved much in several days. And there are different theories as to why. It seems kind of wasteful to just have them there, not doing much. One theory is that the Russians are just trying to build up supplies for a big push on Kiev. Another theory is that they're just backed up in a kind of traffic jam, and that they're having trouble not only moving forward, but also maintaining those vehicles in the traffic jam. Because from what I read, it's sufficiently cold in Ukraine that they basically cannot turn off the vehicles and just let them sit in the cold.
So that's going to rip through fuel.
Yeah, so they have to idle them. Otherwise, I'm not mechanically minded, so maybe somebody in chat knows better, but basically the trucks will lock up if they turn them off, don't run them, and then try to start them again in the cold. So they have to keep them running, and that means they're burning through fuel, and because there's so many vehicles, there's a lot of fuel. So in addition to trying to move supplies to the front to help the troops that are already there, they're also having to move a bunch of supplies just to maintain these trucks that are in this convoy that's stuck in this jam. And so it's kind of turning into a black hole that's sucking up more and more resources. You have to supply the trucks that are trying to supply the trucks that are trying to supply the troops. And it creates a negative feedback loop that just makes it logistically complicated to the point where it may be overwhelming the logistical officers responsible.
Yo, dog, I heard you like trucks, so I got trucks for your truck so you can truck while you truck. There was a quote that I remember you told me a while back about people talking about war and how certain people talk about strategy. Some people talk about tactics, and then it's professionals who talk about logistics, because it doesn't really matter how good your tank is. If your tank is out of fuel and out of position, it's basically just a hunk of metal.
Yeah. Yeah, amateurs talk about tactics, aficionados talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics. I'm sure there are different versions of that quote, but that's the one that I remember. Yeah, logistics are super important, and it seems the Ukrainians in particular are really focusing on that. The Russians have never really been known for being strong on logistics, and in warfare, you always want to try to exploit weaknesses in your opponent. So it seems the Ukrainians are really homing in on Russian logistics to try to exploit that pressure point, and it seems to be working thus far. There's been a number of reports of Russian vehicles, just being abandoned because they ran out of gas. And the Ukrainians in particular have been exploiting Russian troops that overextend by trying to raid supply convoys behind them. Because from what I've been reading, the Russians have been advancing in a single echelon. Normally you want multiple echelons where you advance with one unit and then you have another unit behind that that's maybe a couple miles behind that that's responsible for protecting the supply line. And then you'll have another unit behind that a couple miles. So that's multiple echelons. But I've read that the Russians are attacking with a single echelon, which means they're not really protecting their supply line, which means it's very vulnerable. So, in particular, when Russian units advance well into Ukrainian territory with unprotected flanks, that makes that supply line very vulnerable. And it seems that a number of units are just literally running out of fuel and either surrendering or trying to retreat back to their line.
Yep, in StarCraft we would call that pre-splitting your units a little bit, where you have not all your forces concentrated in one big clump, but you have some units protecting the reinforcement line, some units that are in the front, and then some that are in the middle. It also means that you're less vulnerable to a single strike at any one point, which they have this huge convoy that's all clumped up in one spot. But I guess that convoy isn't being struck by Ukraine because they would need air to do that.
Well, that's a little complicated. They actually do have air assets. Again, the Russians have not suppressed their air defenses, but neither have they suppressed entirely the Ukrainian Air Force. The situation is described online as being contested. So who controls the air at a given time kind of varies, basically. So the Ukrainians do not have air superiority, but they are able to fly aircraft now and again, and they have been able to launch airstrikes against Russian ground forces. And I've read that they have attacked that northern convoy several times now, but they have not destroyed it. And I think that's just because they would need greater control of the air in order to kind of just really obliterate it. There's lots of memes online of A-10 pilots, wanting just salivating at the opportunity to attack a convoy like this, because this is pretty much what the A-10 was designed for, almost. But the Ukrainians just don't have that opportunity, and they don't really have the ranged fire capability to obliterate it either. So for the moment, they're having to rely on special forces raids and the occasional airstrike, as well as drone strikes. That's about the best they can do.
Did you have anything on the strike at the nuclear reactor?
Oh, the drama in Zaporizhia, or Zaporizhia. I think that's how it's pronounced. Yeah, the media kind of sensationalized that. There was a lot more drama over that than there needed to be. It's true that there was fighting on site. Well, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the largest nuclear plant in Europe is located in a Ukrainian city called Zaporizhia. And the Russians managed to blitz to that city and were fighting with the Ukrainians for control of it. And the fighting spread to the nuclear power plant. But the power plant itself was never actually attacked, nor was it the site of fighting. Rather, there were just some facilities on site that were the site of fighting. So there were some buildings around the plant that were shelled and attacked, but the actual power plant itself was not attacked, and it was never really in danger, or at least not in as much danger as it was kind of made out to be. And I think there was actually a deal to basically hand it over, partly to just avoid that eventuality in any case. And I also read that even if it had been attacked, even if there had been a reactor breach, it would not have been as bad as Chernobyl. Apparently, Chernobyl had, well, the big reason that Chernobyl was a problem because the reactor was lined with graphite. And it was the graphite that kind of escaped and caused most of the problems. But this nuclear power plant does not have graphite, or at least its reactor isn't lined with it like Chernobyl was, such that if there were a reactor breach, it would not create this massive plume that would spread out and contaminate a broad area around the reactor. So there wasn't nearly as much danger as people kind of made it out to be. So there was drama about it, but it wasn't really all that justified. But that's pretty much the summary of it. But I was going to say the Russians are also suffering from poor maintenance. It seems like a lot of the vehicles that they're using were not properly maintained in storage or in the field, whichever was the case. So there was one guy who had a long Twitter thread talking about blown tires. Apparently, you're not really supposed to just let vehicles out in the sun because the tires have problems. or at least you're supposed to, if they are out in the sun, you have to you're supposed to park them in a certain way in order to minimize exposure or something like that. I'm not an expert, so I can't really judge, a lot of these Twitter threads. But I have been taking notes on them just as evidence. And it seems that people with backgrounds in logistics have said that all of the blown tires and other mechanical failures that the Russian army has been suffering suggests that there's either poor maintenance practices or corruption within the Russian military, if not both. And that's also hobbling some of their efforts here. It's worth noting, too, there's been shortages of food rations. Part of that is because of the logistical snarls, so there's been reports of Russian infantry just basically not having food. And also, there's been footage of Russian infantry basically raiding grocery stores in order to try to get food. I don't know if we mentioned that last time or not, but there's been more videos of that happening.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like the Russian troops on the front have not been getting sufficiently fed or armed in order to kind of really be fully effective. And there was also reports based off of intercepted radio communications suggesting that Russian troops have been forced to sleep out in the open. I think this is more the conscripts than sort of the regulars, but it seems that some of the conscripts were not fed and were not given any shelter and just kind of had to sleep out in the open for a time because command basically just lost track of them, and that led to them basically telling their commanders that they were going home, to allow them to go home, or that they were going to go home one way or the other. So there's been struggles, to put it mildly, for the command structure on the Russian side here, it would seem. And it could be that there's a shortage of trucks. We don't know for sure, but there has been a couple of videos released of Russian trains carrying buses and cars and trucks and things like that. And it's presumed that they're headed for Ukraine in order to assist with the logistical problems. But if that's the case, that really speaks poorly of the logistical planning here. One might have argued that the problem was just the scale of the operation and maybe the impromptu nature of it. But if they're running out of trucks, that suggests a broader problem there, just with the organization of the Russian army as a whole. I mean, just to kind of zoom out a little bit and talk more broadly here, some of the conversation I've seen online is kind of, well, it could be, to summarize, it could be that this conflict turns out to be something like the Winter War, where the Soviets were surprised by the tenacity of the Finns and were poorly led, and their logistics were poor, kind of like they are now, to the point where the Finns were able to eke out well, not a Pyrrhic, but a quasi victory. The way it panned out in the Winter War is that the Russians were defeated in the first couple of offensives, but then they retrenched and reorganized, and then they came back and were able to actually make gains. But because of Western pressure and the cost of further operations, they ended up signing a peace with Finland that was relatively favorable to Finland. So that could be what the Ukrainian government is going for here. And that's more or less what they're on track for thus far, if they can keep things up, if they can keep current trends up. But unless the Russian army really makes significant improvements in their operations in the next couple of days or in the next week, that's going to really call into question the quality of the Russian army as a whole. Because what we're seeing right now is kind of a clown show in terms of command, logistics, and other abstractions relating to the quality of the Russian military. And in that sense, if the Ukrainian military is actually able to exploit those to the point that the Russian army is quasi immobilized, then this could turn out to be something more like the Russo-Japanese War, where the Russians thought they were going to get an easy victory against a weak foe, but then were humiliated. And
Yeah,
it's too early. Sorry?
that's underestimating the opponent and not committing nearly as many forces as you would actually need to win. And that kind of goes back to the question I had earlier of, did the Russians expect this level of support from other countries in the terms of both economic pressure applied to them and then also just brand new equipment? Like a bunch of javelins, a bunch of Stinger missiles, a bunch of things that the Ukrainian people can operate, and even just infantry personnel can operate, that are really cost effective for defending in this case, and also the tenacity and the morale. Because this is kind of a question I had for figures like L. Ron Hubbard, where they make a religion and they get really wrapped up in an ideology, and you kind of wonder, do they believe their own bullshit here? Because if Putin genuinely believed that Russia was just so overwhelmingly strong, and as soon as they start knocking on the door, Ukraine's gonna bow down and accept him as saving them from their problems or whatever, and then they really don't, and they fight really hard against him, that was just like a really big mindset failure, and not really assessing what the state of the game was, and basically making the mistake of arrogance, which we've seen some other dictators and stuff do in the past. I did some looking into like Putin as a leader, and I was wondering, Russians are protesting, do they vote? Like, can they vote him out? How does that work? And not really.
Well, not really, no. I mean, technically they have what's called an illiberal democracy, and so technically there are opposition parties that you can vote for, but all of them have been co-opted. Like, you're really not allowed, basically, to start a real opposition party. So it's not practically feasible in the sense that there's not really anybody to vote for. And even if there were, there's widespread election fraud in Russia to the point where it probably wouldn't matter anyway. So between election fraud and the lack of opposition, or actual opposition parties anyway, it's not really feasible to vote Putin out. At least as things stand now. But to answer your question, yeah, it seems more and more that they were genuinely caught off guard by the degree of resistance. Whether they were caught off guard by the Western response is a little more unclear. There is some evidence now that they were not expecting sanctions, or at least not substantive sanctions. So that seems to have caught them off guard. I haven't seen evidence one way or the other that they were surprised about Western arms being sent to Ukraine. So I can't really tell you what to think of that. But yeah, they were definitely surprised. Yeah, Ukrainian resistance is a big factor. Western support is a big factor, but I can't really stress enough that the main shock right now, certainly in the past week, has just been the underperformance of Russian logistics. That's like pretty much the MVP of the conflict right now. As counterintuitive as that may seem.
Well, in StarCraft terms, we would say that Ukraine isn't necessarily super outsmarting or outplaying Russia. Russia is not playing their hand very well, so they're kind of throwing in the sense of not representing as strong of a hand as they should here, and they're really not taking care of their own pieces on the board.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. And again, it's only, what, the second week now? So it's still early going. There's evidence that the Russians are pulling up reserves. There are forces in Vladivostok that were filmed being loaded onto trains. Presumably those are headed for Ukraine. But it's not clear yet just how far they're willing to go, or just how that's going to play out. It's not even really clear what the situation is on the ground as far as Russian forces. I've read that Russian forces themselves don't know, that supposedly there are whole units that have lost contact with command, and they just don't know where they are or what they're doing. But that hasn't been verified either. But more broadly, what I've read is that 90+% of the Russian invasion force that was prepped beforehand has now been committed to Ukraine. In other words, it's now inside the country. How much of that force has engaged with the Ukrainian military and or is otherwise actively, taking territory or expanding out, that's not clear yet. I've seen some different takes on that. Some people were saying that most of the Russian forces haven't actually really fought yet. So that would suggest that there's still room for them to kind of make progress, and that maybe some of the early performance is just, haphazard logistics and whatnot that's going to be overcome in the near future. But I've also seen people arguing that the Russians have already committed their best units. Like the first tank army, or the fourth, or whatever it was, supposedly that's already been committed, and there's been some forces that belong to that unit that have been spotted that have been destroyed. So it could be that the Russians have committed their best forces and they've already been either defeated or checked, and that the Russians are trying to scramble in order to find replacements, hence the video of units in other parts of Russia being moved to the front. So, sort of the most optimistic take is that the Russian logistical train is being obliterated by rearguard actions by Ukrainian forces of one sort or another, and that they're having to scramble to send trucks to the front, and that they're having to rely increasingly on green forces, conscripts, as well as forces from places like Chechnya or other allied, well, not other allied nations, but allied nations in CISTO in order to try to replace units that have been lost thus far. That's the most optimistic take that I've seen as of now. And that's the take that suggests this could be a repeat of the Russo-Japanese War, and that maybe Russia is on the verge of being humiliated. But more realistically, we're not really seeing the full picture uh, because like you mentioned earlier, most of what we see online is sort of pro-Ukrainian or from the Ukrainian perspective. The Russians have been making gains. They've taken more territory since the last week, especially in the south. Um, Whether they overextend and get cut off is an open question. I don't know if the Ukrainians are going to do that or if they even still have the capability to do that, but technically it is possible. But the Russians have been taking ground, and they have been inflicting losses on the Ukrainians. I think the last time the Ukrainians officially reported their losses, it suggested that they were taking basically one-for-one losses. Like for every Russian loss, there's basically an equal number of Ukrainians who have been lost. I don't know if that's still the case because that number was pretty early on, like in the first couple days, basically. So the number could be skewed one way or the other, depending on how things have gone in the past week. We just don't entirely know right now. But the Ukrainians are definitely taking losses, so that should not be undercut. And the Russians have lots of reserves they can mobilize. I mean, it's a huge country. Like if they really wanted to go hard, they could just mobilize every, man over age 18, and they would have a couple million ready to go in that case. They would probably not be very combat effective, but it's not as though Russia hasn't had a history of throwing numbers at problems in warfare. So that could work if they really wanted to do that. I did see some evidence that maybe that wouldn't be feasible, just because it would be so costly to have a mass mobilization like that, and it may not be that they could afford that or maybe even organize it, because again, the organizational capacity of the Russian military has always kind of been suspect, but is especially suspect at this point. So it's not entirely clear they could even really manage that, but that remains to be seen. But yeah, that's all stuff that the Russian military could do. And again, it's speculation that they haven't committed their best units yet. That could be false. It could be that they haven't committed them or that they've only partially committed them such that they still could unleash them. And we could see then, in that case, surprising gains and progress on the part of the Russian military campaign. So that's all stuff to kind of watch in the near future. But again, like I said earlier, if it doesn't happen in the next week or so, people are going to start really raising questions about whether or not the optimistic scenario that I outlined could be the real thing. That would be shocking, genuinely shocking, if that were the case. That would seriously upend the perspective of the quality of the Russian military and the strategic threat that Russia posed, not only to the United States and the West, but also to China. Like it would really reorient the balance of power in global affairs. I mean, it would have broader implications than just Ukraine, basically. But yeah, that's just something to watch for. Again, the Russians could surprise us. Maybe they're just holding back everything, and they could just unleash their air force and their armor, and we could see collapse of the Ukrainian front lines in the next week or two. That's also possible, but obviously the optimistic take is the preferable one for most third-party observers, I suspect. So that's kind of what people are hoping for. We'll see. It's high drama. It's not panning out how anybody expected. Certainly, even the early takes that I saw amongst analysts in the first couple days have not really panned out. The Russians have definitely underperformed, not only in the first couple days, but like even in the past week. They're not making the kinds of gains that you would expect, and they've been taking losses that you would not expect either. I think they lost something like 6 aircraft a day or two ago, which is a lot of aircraft to lose in a single day in the context of a modern war. It's pretty rough losses for the Russian Air Force in that sense. And the Russian paratroopers have continued to take losses as well. There's even a rumor I saw that there was one plane load of paratroopers that was accidentally dropped in the Black Sea. I haven't seen that verified yet, but given their performance thus far, it almost wouldn't surprise me.
And then one of the things we talked about last week was the motive for all this and how you can't really see any motive aside from nationalism and expansionism because of how costly this is. Like the economic hit wouldn't be offset by just taking whatever resource that Ukraine has and adding them to Russia, because even if they did take it and make it into a puppet state where they install a leader and so on, you've still got to fix the stuff that you've blasted in the war. Like they're
Yep.
damaging the area very substantially, which is also racking up costs, which we haven't really talked about yet because we don't know what the extent of the damage is going to be. But yeah, it's definitely a big part of the overall picture that just makes this a really like cost ineffective exchange.
Yeah, I would add the caveat that I would not say that nationalism is the only, driver here, the only motivator. NATO expansion and other factors, economic or political or what have you, do factor in. But like you say, when you look at the cost benefit analysis, nationalism seems to be the one thing that kind of squares all the circles, so to speak. Because yeah, I mean, taking Ukraine is not going to turn Russia into a superpower.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to give it like a big economic edge. So in terms of an economic asset, it's not really that vital. I know some people in chat last time were citing the fact that there was, natural gas and stuff in Ukraine, but there's not all of that much. Certainly not enough to justify something like this. And Russia has a lot, not only in Russia, but amongst allied nations like Kazakhstan. A lot of the natural gas that Russia sells in Europe, if not also in China, is not actually Russian gas. I think I remember reading years ago that Russia actually consumes most of the oil and natural gas that it produces. So a relatively small margin of that gets exported, and a good chunk of the rest of the exports is actually stuff that's re-exported from Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, etc. So I don't think that natural resources are the main driver here. Um, there's some reason there are some manufacturing centers in Ukraine that have historically been tied into supply chains for military equipment in Russia, but I don't think that alone would really justify this either. It's just not there's just not that much, and a lot of those supply chains were broken back in 2014, and I imagine the Russians have long since uh, redesigned those supply chains, found workarounds and replacements and whatnot. So I don't really see that as an impetus either. So just economically speaking, it doesn't really add up.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like the cost of rebuilding Ukraine after it, the cost of the invasion itself, the opportunity it cost in terms of trade that you're going to lose because of sanctions. Like it doesn't really make sense. And maybe they had rosy predictions about the lack of sanctions. Maybe they didn't think there would be any. That seems to be the case. But even then, they would have had to have expected some response. And even a relatively minimal sanctions response would not really justify this. Would have made it more costly than beneficial. So just I don't buy the economic argument. I don't think it's substantive, just based off of the argumentation I've seen thus far. Um, Politically, I mean, Putin and the United Russia Party are relatively unpopular now, but if this is a wag the dog, it is one hell of a wag the dog. Like normally, if a government does something like this, it'll be like airstrikes. Like that's what it was in the United States in the 1990s. There would be maybe like a bombing in we would go bomb Iraq, or maybe we'd get involved in like Kosovo, for example. So there's long been speculation that part of the impetus for U.S. involvement in the Balkans was to try to deflect attention away from the Monica Lewinsky scandal and other stuff like that. But a fully fledged invasion like this, I don't think that would warrant a wag. I don't think that would be a wag the dog. It seems like they were going for something much bigger there. Like even if you expect minimal resistance, like a full-fledged land invasion like that, even with minimal resistance, would be a lot more than wag the dog, I think. So I would rule that out as well. So if it's not economic and it's not really political in the sense that I outlined, like what else would it be? So the only thing else you can really point to is national security. And that's what a lot of Russians point to. They say that it's, NATO expansion. They don't want NATO on their border. NATO's already on their border and hasn't really done anything in like 30 years, but okay. I guess I could see how hypothetically NATO expanding to Ukraine could put NATO in an advantageous position in a hypothetical future conflict. So there is that argument. But there are other ways to do this besides the fully fledged invasion. Like if you're really worried about NATO expansion, then there's a spectrum of possibilities, a spectrum of policy options with which to respond to that. And there's a number of them that would that would prevent Ukraine from joining NATO in the medium to long term that don't involve doing this. So that begs the question, why did the Russian government choose this approach of the myriad options that they had available? And that's an open question right now that nobody really has a full answer to. Mm-hmm. And, for me, the best answer I could come up with on my part, for whatever that's worth, is nationalism. Like they really want to kind of send a signal that Russia is back, they're a big power, that Ukraine really is like a de facto colonial possession of people that implicitly belong to the Russian sphere of influence and that have a destiny of being assimilated into the broader Russian culture. Like it's a kind of quasi-imperialist project with a side of thumbing their nose at the West almost, just kind of showing how badass they are that they're willing to do something this aggressive, even though the West didn't want them to. So signaling almost, in a sense, with a side of, again, Russian nationalist imperialism kind of thrown in on the side. That makes some sense. Like it has some holes in the sense that, that's a big undertaking to undergo just for that reason. But I don't see a whole lot of other impetus that can kind of explain it. Like, what else? Why else would they do that to this degree? Like, it just doesn't make a lot of sense in a lot of different ways. And it's worth mentioning, too, that you had that guy who asked about that, the link you sent. So that wasn't an interview with an FSB agent, and I actually did, read that, the English translation. What that was a leaked letter, allegedly. This is an alleged leaked letter from an FSB agent who disagrees with, the Russian government's actions in Ukraine. I think the Twitter thread in question referred to him as a whistleblower. And this letter, well, I should add here that the Twitter thread in question was posted by an executive director, I think, of Bellingcat, which is a really respected open source intelligence outfit. And he says that he showed the letter to some of his, contacts, quote unquote, in the FSB. And they told him that they think the letter is from an FSB agent, from a colleague, as they put it. They disagreed with some of the conclusions and opinions in the letter, but they said that they thought, based off of what they read, that it seemed genuine. So if you trust Bellingcat and you trust this guy as an executive director of Bellingcat, then that would suggest it's the genuine article. And so just based off of some of the things he said, well, there's a lot to take in there. He said quite a few things, but yeah. I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with that?
The reasons for Russia to do this.
The reasons for Russia to do this. Oh, right. So I was going to say, like, even people, according to this letter, anyway, in so much as you want to trust it, the implication of the letter is that even the upper levels of Russian intelligence, like the analytical community in the Russian government, even they were not told about this beforehand. They were writing up possibilities, like they were writing up forecasts, like if we invade, then what would happen? What would the West do? How would we respond, etc. So they were writing up reports in that vein, but they were told that it was extremely unlikely and that this was basically just spitballing. Don't worry too much about it. Just kind of have these reports ready so that if something happens, we'll be ready to go. And the author of the letter in question also pointed out that they were being pressured to write reports that would give relatively favorable outcomes to Russia. So in that sense, they were not like they were not writing fully objective reports. They were on the receiving end of some political pressure, and so they were shocked then when the invasion actually happened. Like according to the letter, they didn't know it was going to happen until it happened, and they were caught totally off balance. And as a result, they're just totally overworked right now, trying to game out all of the things that could happen, all of the things that the West is doing and could do, all of the things that Russia could do in response. Like, there's just so many moving parts right now to Russia's strategic position that they can't even really cope with it all. And they're having trouble drawing up policy responses as a result. So all of that would suggest that the invasion was not something that was like really well prepared in advance. Like it seems like they thought that they might invade and built up enough forces to maybe do it, and then launched the invasion predicated on some very rosy assumptions. And again, all without really fully preparing. And the whole thing in that sense really reeks of the Iraq War. I don't know how many people listening are old enough to really remember that, but the Bush administration kind of leaned hard on the analytical community in America's intelligence agencies to make very favorable, rosy forecasts about what an invasion of Iraq would look like. And then they went and invaded, and of course, all of it just blew up in their face. Like all of the assumptions were wrong, and it turned into this long, drawn out quagmire. And it seems that the Russians have basically been doing the same thing, which is a little bit ironic because I've noted, not only in chat, but also just in other sources that a lot of Russians seem to be trying to partially justify the Russian operation by citing the Iraq War. But they seem to be replicating the Iraq War in like all of its worst aspects. They say that, if the United States can do this, why can't we? But, it seems like they're saying if the United States can do something stupid and self-defeating, why can't Russia? It's weird logic. Like if you want to replicate Iraq, then yeah, I can see why you might want to do something unilaterally. But that's not the takeaway. It seems like they're just copying all of the dumb shit that the United States did.
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't fathom why. Like, of all the things you could learn from Iraq, why wouldn't you learn from the dumb shit? It just blows my mind.
Well, if you look at it from a egotistical perspective, it could be, well, we're going to show them how it's really done. And maybe you try to do a similar thing, but do it better, but you don't actually take that critical lens of prepare for the worst. I think it's a good approach whenever you're dealing with something that's really risky or costly, even just for your average person. If you're going to try some new project that you don't really have great precedent with, asking the question of what could go wrong, how could this go sideways, and then what contingency plans do we have in the case that it's not going to be as easy as we think, which does require you to be humble to make those assessments and say, all right, we're not invincible. Any effort that is great is going to involve some difficulty. How can we insulate ourselves against that difficulty? Propaganda is a hell of a drug. You can think very highly of yourself if you smoke on that stuff.
Well, as the old saying goes, don't smoke your own stuff.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to believe it. That's supposed to be for the public.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't say for sure that, the Russian planners just were totally unaware. But, like, the more dysfunctional the war becomes on the Russian end, the more it kind of looks like they really did just make a lot of dumb assumptions. And it's just really surprising.
Mm-hmm.
People had relatively high expectations of the quality of the Russian military going into the conflict, and those expectations are falling by the day.
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing okay on time?
Yep. 1 hour 15 in.
I don't know if you have, I don't know if you're in the middle of something, but if you look at a map of Ukraine and you kind of zoom in, you can see how densely populated it is. Like there's so many little villages scattered around. And that really kind of illustrates how difficult it would be if Russia does manage to kind of take the whole country, how difficult it would be to actually occupy it.
Yeah, that's a major difference between Iraq and Afghanistan and Ukraine is you're dealing with a very different situation in terms of population and then also proximity to other countries that are willing to help out with that. Let me see if this link works. It's trying to get me to purchase stuff. Ugh. No, I just want a map. Population density map.
Yeah, each of those little villages that you can see, if you look at Google Maps, each of those could be a center of resistance. And granted Russia would have some advantage in being culturally similar. So, they could send agents to infiltrate and whatnot. But it's going to take a lot of resources to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have Ukraine map up. Here. This is not AFK though. Let me fix this. Yeah, so you're saying each city could be fought over because you have a decent chunk of the population who are there, and you have to have a unique battle for each of them to command that area.
Oh no, that's not quite my point here. My point is that like the small villages
Oh.
could be points of resistance because it's going to be extremely difficult to garrison them all. Like if you zoom into the area around Kiev,
Mm-hmm.
like the rural area, there's a lot of villages. And you would pretty much have to garrison them all in order to ensure that people there didn't provide aid and comfort to potential rebels or partisans.
Oh yeah. All of these here. Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's a big difference between if you're looking at the Iraq War as an example. Can you beat their military in a conventional contest? Maybe yes, but can you then control all of these areas here too and keep them like under whatever your leadership is going to be? That process is a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult than just winning in the direct military contest.
exactly. And that FSB letter that we mentioned, the author talked about that specifically. He said that even if they managed to occupy the country, then what? Like, he suggested actually that occupation would be beyond the means of Russia. He said they would need something like 500,000 troops in order to occupy Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And he suggested that they just didn't have the resources for that. Like they would probably have the manpower if they absolutely needed it. They could, draft probably 500,000 soldiers, but paying for them and equipping them and that would all just probably be beyond Russia's means. It would just be too expensive.
Yeah, and expensive is a word to watch out for when you're getting sanctioned to hell.
Yeah, the Russian economy probably will be relatively resilient to that, but it's still going to be under a lot of strain in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
I did read the other day about a protest in a Russian city. I don't remember. I think it was Novopiskov, or maybe that's probably a Ukrainian city. I don't remember which Russian city it was, but there was a strike, a union strike no less, at a factory because the factory owners could not pay their workers because the ruble had devalued so much. So that could be a problem going forward if there is more and more civil unrest stemming not from anti-war sentiment, but because of a lack of ability to pay people. That could really undermine the Russian government's ability not only to garnish tax revenue to pay for the war, but also just to continue to maintain the necessary minimal legitimacy required to continue to operate at all. So that's an outside possibility. I don't think the Russian government is going to collapse in the near future, if at all. But certainly, if there are big problems with people getting their money, getting paid, getting basic necessities, public support is going to plummet very quickly. Because one of the patterns we've seen is that while the Russian public in general is relatively pro-war, probably more than people in the West realize, um, public support is also very mercenary in Russia historically. They're not going to support the government at all costs. Right now it's relatively easy, but as the sanctions kind of dig deeper and bite harder, it's going to kind of test the public support. There's going to be hardline nationalists that support him no matter what. That's for sure. But whether or not sort of the rank and file, sort of basic apathetic Russian is really going to continue to back the government like they have been, that's in question. That's going to be more of a medium term thing, though. That's going to be like weeks or months. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But we've seen early signs, at least, of some discontent in that vein. And it's that kind of discontent that will cause the Russian government to really change its calculus once it gains steam, or if it gains steam. Well, did we have any other thing you wanted to kind of cover here?
I'm trying to think of major types of topics. The oligarchy, I guess there's a sort of discussion brewing in the chat a little bit about who really controls Russia. Is it ultimately Putin, or is it the oligarchs? Is it a combination of the two of them? The concept of patronage networks is something that you've talked about before, and I guess it's a little bit muddy to us, the notion of who has the power. In the U.S. government, and just as a side note here, the two speakers here in Voice are both from the United States, so we're viewing the world from that lens and have those biases. But we have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, and they each check and balance each other's power. In Russia, it doesn't work that way. There isn't really a branch of equal power to Putin's executive branch where they can just say, no, you can't actually do this. We veto that. If he wants to do something, he can, but he needs to appease the oligarchs to such an extent that they continue to choose him as being the head of the state. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, that's an accurate portrayal. Yeah, the political system in Russia is dominated by Vladimir Putin. He's at the tippity top, for sure. And his patronage network is largely filled out by national security guys. Generally they're people who had served in the KGB or had been personal bodyguards of Putin. I think even his chef turned into a pretty significant official in Russian politics. He's the guy that heads the Wagner group. So there's a lot of these types of people that Putin has either personal connections with or professional connections with, whom fill out his patronage network. The oligarchs are relevant, but they kind of lost the battle for control of Russia, a long time ago. They had been major players back in the 90s, but over time, Putin made, strategic alliances and kind of grew his own patronage network and effectively crowded them out. Hypothetically, they could make a comeback of some kind, but I think it would be extremely difficult right now because they have just very little public support. The population really just does not like them. So it's not like they're popular, charismatic figures who are going to lead a revolution. That's not going to happen. Like, best case scenario is that they would be able to get enough support amongst Putin's entourage that they could push him out and replace him with something else. But even Putin's own entourage, his network, even they don't like oligarchs, maybe even especially them. So the oligarchs aren't going to be able to really make a move here. Or if they do, they would be taking a big risk. If there is going to be a challenge to Putin's authority, it would probably come within the Siloviki community that is in his patronage network. But they're so nationalist and so gung-ho for stuff like this, like the war in Ukraine and whatnot. I have a hard time seeing them turn on Putin over something like this. Even if things continue to go badly, I don't think they would turn on him. Something I read about Putin recently was that, when he encounters difficulties, he tends to double down. Mm-hmm. So it's not his sort of pathology to encounter difficulties and then back off. It seems more likely, based off of precedent, that he's going to just try even harder. So that suggests that even if the Russian army has had difficulties here in the early going, that the Russian government is not going to take that as a signal that they need to negotiate or reach a negotiated settlement or what have you. Instead, they're going to take it as a signal that they need to dump more resources on in order to avoid a humiliation.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the fighting could actually be about to get a lot worse, if only just for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's credible. I think that's probably going to be his approach. So I would
Well,
expect harder fighting to come.
that would fit with the sort of heavy nationalist slant to all of this, which is uh, losing would be even worse than not engaging to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, so in that sense, we could see one of two things then. We could see the Ukrainians break under the pressure of a renewed Russian offensive, or we could see what's called gambler's fallacy, where the Russians just dump more and more forces in to no effect, but keep dumping more in because they want to make up for the losses they've already incurred.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see how things pan out. It's still early days. I know I keep saying that like a broken record, but I think it's important for people not to be overly optimistic or overly pessimistic at this stage. The situation is very fluid. But let's see. I mean, I've got lots of notes here if we want to get through them here, but I don't know if we have like questions or if there was something else you wanted to do.
I think we can go with notes. We got a
Okay.
few of the questions just as we've been going about
Oh,
the
I see.
thread and then the plane deal.
Well, do we have is Vatuel here? Vatuil?
I don't see him in the chat. If you're here, you can make yourself known, Vatwell.
Okay. Well, I owe him an apology.
Oh.
Yeah, he said in chat last time that Taiwan was a thing, quote unquote, because of the Chinese Civil War. And he said that in response to me saying that China wanted Taiwan back principally because of Japanese imperialism. So I said that he wasn't right, but when I went back and thought about it again, actually, yes, he is right. It
Oh.
is. Yeah, we gave Taiwan back to Japan. Well, sorry, not Japan. We gave Taiwan back to the Kuomintang, the Chinese government, after World War II. And it was only after that that it became sort of the last bastion of the Kuomintang at the end of the Chinese Civil War. So he's right that Taiwan is a thing only because of that. So I tried to think about it, and I think the reason I brought up Japanese imperialism as the impetus, the main impetus for China wanting to take back Taiwan, was predicated on a conversation I had. For whatever this is worth, I had a conversation with a guy from China when I was in grad school, way back when. This is way back in like my first year or two. And the topic of Taiwan came up. I was just kind of curious what he thought about it, and he said that we really don't like them. And I said, really? Well, why is that? And the point he brought up is because they liked Japan so much and embraced Japanese culture so much, and that for him was offensive, and apparently for other people in China.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was notable that he brought Japan up specifically rather than mentioning the Chinese Civil War. So you would think if the Chinese people, and if not the Chinese government more broadly, were really focused on the Chinese Civil War as the impetus for reunification, then that would have been sort of the first thing he said. Revenge against the Kuomintang or something like that, or just ending the Civil War, or reuniting a lost province. But Japan was the first thing that came up. And I always kind of kept that in the back of my head. And so I guess that's why I kind of made the point that Japanese imperialism was the more important factor than something else like the Chinese Civil War. But I just wanted to. Sorry, go ahead.
Would you welcome another correction? I'll message that to Vatwell. He might watch this in the VOD after. I don't see him in the chat now. But chat, just so you're aware, Agent Smith, he's not right about everything. I know some people may be like, wait, what? It happens. Even clever people can be wrong sometimes. Do you welcome another correction here?
Of course.
So the fallacy you're referring to is not gambler's fallacy, it's sunk cost fallacy.
The same thing.
No, gambler's fallacy is when you see one outcome happen a bunch of times and you think it is each time increasing the opposite outcome. So, gambler's fallacy for the war would be because Russia had some sloppy engagements for the first 2 weeks, they assume that it's going to just be better the next weeks just to average out. Human intuition expects outcomes to average out, even though that's not really how nature and math work. It's just a heuristic, a mental shortcut that brains take. The one that you described was sunk cost fallacy, where the cost has already been sunk into this investment here, so we might as well keep committing into it, even though that might not necessarily be the best choice.
Well, thank you for that correction. I think that's a mistake I've made before, too.
That's Moss Neotech naming the sunk cost. I was kind of raising my eyebrow and I was like, that doesn't seem like gambler's fallacy. The fun gambler's fallacy example that I get to think about in gaming a lot is in Dota and in Han. There are two runes that spawn that can give you double damage, haste, illusion, or some other effects. And they can either spawn at top in the river or at bottom in the river. And a lot of people will say, okay, well, it spawned top 3 times in a row, so it's probably going to spawn bottom next. It's just a natural thing that the human brain tends to assume when it isn't necessarily the case. That is gambler's fallacy. With roulette, that's the main example for gambling, where if it's been red a certain number of times or black a certain number of times, people will think, well, it's about time for it to be red again, when probability doesn't actually care about that. It doesn't care about past outcomes when future outcomes are being determined.
Well, thank you for that elaboration.
Mm-hmm.
That's my mistake. I need to brush up on my game theory, it seems.
Have you considered playing video games?
Wrong kind of theory. Not quite appropriate. I've been playing Left 4 Dead 2 lately. That's sort of been the main thing, and I don't know that that's really helping my game theory. Let's see, but I wanted to issue that correction for Vatuel. He's issued other corrections like that before for stuff I've gotten wrong, so it's always appreciated. Thank you, sir. But let's see, what else? I'll try to get through this. I didn't quite organize this into categories like I wanted to, so this is going to be a little all over the place. Are you familiar with Paddington Bear?
No. What is that?
I was expecting you to say yes. I didn't, I didn't quite have a follow.
Oh,
Paddington Bear. Okay. Paddington Bear is a British brand. It's almost like Winnie the Pooh. It's like a character. And there's been children's books like Paddington Bear children's books and whatnot. And I think that's where he comes from, if I'm not mistaken. And there were some CGI movies made. I think 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I didn't catch the year of release. But basically, there was at least one Paddington Bear movie released. And in Ukraine, the CGI bear, Paddington Bear, was voiced by none other than Mr. Zelensky himself.
Mm.
So, not really relevant or important information, but it was interesting trivia I saw online. Guy's had quite the career leading up to his current adventures.
This is kind of a quip. It's not really a factual or scientific statement, but there was the joke going around that some countries elected a politician and got a clown, and Ukraine elected a clown and got a leader. I guess leader is the term. But he's definitely stepped up from having more of an entertainment career to being a legitimate leader who has a good deal of charisma. I think that's a stat that just plays directly from one into the other. But then also sticking with his people and stuff, it means a lot for them, and morale. Morale management is huge for how effective your troops are. It's just how much they believe that they can win.
Yeah, I concur. You know, again, I would reiterate what I said last time, which is that the Russians are still trying to assassinate him. Near as we can tell from the reports I've been reading, there are actually two separate groups that have been dispatched to Kiev and are operating clandestinely, trying to track not only Zelensky, but other high-value targets in Ukrainian government. One of those groups is Chechens, from what I read, and then the other one is Wagner Group mercenaries. There have apparently been three separate attempts now, but they've all but failed thus far, if you want to believe the reports anyway. So more power to him for sticking it out, even in the face of being explicitly targeted.
Mm-hmm.
Not just his country, but his own person. Let's see,
Yeah.
do you remember the Snake Island thing?
Yes, that was the fuck you warship or whatever.
Yeah. So apparently those guys are still alive. They were not killed, it seems. So either they surrendered like the Russians said they did, or the Russians bombarded the island and then they surrendered, one or the other, depending on who you want to believe. But they are still alive and in captivity at the moment. Let's see. Some other trivia here. There was a really dumb video of some Russian troops who ran out of gas. And so they went to a local Ukrainian police station asking for assistance, after which they were summarily arrested, which is what you would expect to happen.
Hey, do y'all have any gas? Wait, aren't you for the other side? You're under arrest. Oh crap.
Yeah, so there was some humorous images of that. Let's see what else. Kind of a tone shift here. Are you familiar with thermobaric weapons?
Heat pressure is what it sounds like. What is it?
So it's a type of weapon that's designed to ignite the air, basically. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how to describe it technically, but from what I've read, it literally ignites the air in a very wide, broad area. And to the point where if somebody is caught up in the blast, then they're pretty much literally incinerated from the inside out because it ignites the air in your lungs. So this is a really effective weapon if you're dealing with people who are entrenched, like in a cave or in earthworks or a fortress, hypothetically, or a building. Normally, it would be pretty difficult to kill people in defensive positions like that, but if you can just ignite the air, if you can ignite the air inside of the defensive position, then you can kill the defenders relatively easily. So thermobaric weapons have been used.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they were used immediately, like in the first days of the conflict, but since they've shifted over more to a siege mode of conflict, where they're attacking defensive positions with sustained ranged fires, they seem to be using more thermobaric weapons. Certainly, there was at least one thermobaric rocket launcher, missile launcher, whatever it is. There was at least one thermobaric weapons vehicle that was captured by Ukrainians, and we do have footage and pictures of that. So it seems the Russians have been using those in an attempt to try to reduce defensive positions as much as possible. So that's obviously very unfortunate. There's obviously been a lot of media reporting about how cities have come under increasing attack, and if they are attacking, like apartment buildings and stuff with thermobaric weapons, that's not only going to kill any soldiers that are in those buildings, it's almost certainly going to kill a number of civilians as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see the cost benefit here is shifting for the Russians away from concern about civilians to more of a focus on killing as many of the armed defenders as possible, regardless of collateral damage.
Yeah, that's one of the tricky things about when you're the aggressor in a conflict is if you're the aggressor, you're trying to defeat their military, but their civilians are sprinkled in and around them, and it can be tough to distinguish between the two. So a lot of targets like apartment buildings, it could be that the civilians were evacuated and you have all military in there, or it could be all civilians, or it could be a mixture of the two, and it's basically impossible to know for certain what's in all the floors of that building before you start shooting at it. We have a StarCraft 2 professional player named Bly, and he shared a video on Twitter recently of the school that he went to. Might have been his university or his high school, I'm not sure, he didn't specify, but it is like destroyed, like completely destroyed now, and that's kind of surreal to think about. It made me reflect on the schools that I went to, and what if I was looking at that school and it looked like that. you and I went to the same university, like if that place was just reduced to ruin, that would feel really weird and messed up because you're looking at that place and all the memories that you had there, and it's being reduced to rubble.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been quite a bit of destruction, in particular around places like Mariupol and Kharkiv, among other cities.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly there's no shortage of people who are kind of feeling that right now, unfortunately. Even worse is the lying. That was that was one of the lines I remember hearing on the BBC radio recently. There was a woman who had survived the civil war in Bosnia back in the 90s, and I tried to find some audio of it, but I couldn't. But basically, she recorded a message for the people of Ukraine. And one of the things that kind of struck home was, among the many advice that she shared, she said that one of the things that will hurt the most is the lying. And she specified how people will say that it's not actually happening or they deserve it or what have you. And that's also happening. There's been reports from anti-war Russians that they'll argue with their parents or whomever and trying to tell them that the Russian army is targeting cities, uh, but they just won't believe them, like full stop. They'll say that it's not being reported in Russian media. They'll say the Russian army would never do that. There's just a lot of resistance to this idea that the Russian army is doing this within Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And people are kind of at pains to convince them otherwise. And the most extreme example I saw, which I almost couldn't believe when I read it, there was a Russian girl in Kharkiv, and she's in an apartment that has been, shelled, or that is in the area that is being shelled. And she's trying to stay, in the basement, like where it's safe, as much as she can. And she phoned her mother and told her that, she's in danger and that, the city is being shelled. And her mother, full stop, told her that she was wrong. Like, I shit you not. Her mother said that, oh, that can't be happening. That's impossible. Just full stop, would not believe her. Just mind blowing levels of mental gymnastics. It's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. So, unfortunately, a lot of people seem skeptical that this is happening, but it is. Like, you can see the footage. There's just an endless stream of reports from people on the ground, from journalists, from civilians. Like, it's bad enough it's happening at all, but to deny it really cuts deeper.
Mm-hmm.
That's just really offensive to me, as well as to a lot of other people. Certainly the people suffering from it.
Yeah, I guess, a wrestling right now in the information war of what is the truth and what's going on, because there are a whole bunch of partial truths and then half truths and things that are completely dishonest, that are knowingly dishonest for some particular objective. And as a browser of news and a person who's trying to figure out what's going on, it's pretty hard to figure out what's what if you're in a particular place, because you're not getting equal news from all sources at the same time. A lot of people in Russia are getting very heavy propaganda that things are great and amazing, and they're shutting out any information to the contrary. Here in the West, we get more Ukrainian favored news and that kind of a thing. You can browse Russian stuff. Like, we don't have the same restrictions of you can't browse Russian favored slants to things. It's just that there's a language barrier, so you're less likely to read those things in English. But we can only have one objective reality at a given time. So if there are two opposing reports, they can't both be right. And then one thing that I would caution people against is it's not necessarily the truth being right down the middle of the two of them. Sometimes a side will play up their side a little bit, but finding what is exactly going on is pretty difficult to do with the signal to noise ratio. And how often you have things like a certain situation which started as maybe they took a tank and then it turns into a taller tale of they took 4 tanks, and then that kind of snowballs and say, well, I heard they took 20 goddamn tanks, and then it keeps spiraling up from there. And depending on where you are in the information chain, you could be getting eighth hand news. And as
Yeah.
we learned from the telephone game, the message at the end can change dramatically, which is why perhaps Twitch chat and Reddit comments might not be the highest form of information to get news about what's going on, dank as the
Yeah.
memes may be.
Yeah, granted. Certainly, I mean, also things can just be made up out of thin air, like the Ghost of Kiev thing was
Mm-hmm.
just a total fabrication. It wasn't even fabricated by Ukrainians, near as we can tell. It was just wishful thinking on the part of Westerners on Reddit.
Yeah, there is a question too about escalation of nukes and that kind of a thing. And that's one of the main reasons why you're not seeing other militaries just jump into the fray in a conventional war against Russia, is because Russia has a lot of nukes and they don't want to escalate the conflict to that level. And we have the concept of mutually assured destruction, which means that if someone starts nuking someone else, all bets are off on anyone's survival, just because you can nuke in reply and then the world is basically destroyed. So, yeah, I guess the question with that is nuke technology, maybe it hasn't changed a whole bunch since they were first made. I was reading a little bit about the capacity of how much damage a nuke could deal, but then you have the logistical challenge of getting it there. And the larger the bomb, the easier it is to shoot down with missile defense systems, which is why I was reading some stuff about like the SAR bomb, which is super, super huge in
Oh,
weight,
yeah.
and it covers a huge area, but it's also a massive target. And if it's flying through the air, it's going to have a ridiculous heat signature, and you can kind of shoot at it, and it is going to explode still, but it's not going to reach its intended objective.
Yeah.
But you still don't want people to be shooting them off. So we're not working this out in a war capacity so that we're just going to escalate and then deal with the nukes when they come. They're trying to make decisions that are not going to cause an escalation to that level of warfare, because it's bad for everyone.
Yeah, the best way to avoid moving up the escalatory ladder is to not get on it in the first place. So they're really trying to avoid even the first step on that. I mean, otherwise we would have jumped in by now for sure.
Mm-hmm.
There's growing demand for exactly that, but it isn't going to happen. You know, and I mean, it's not even that it would just be guaranteed that there would be a nuclear exchange. Even the risk that it could happen narrows options and basically prohibits involvement.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the kind of gamble you want to take given the expected cost. Even if the risk is low, the damage done if things go wrong is massive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the FS. Go ahead.
and it wouldn't just be damage to wherever they hit. You have like the nuclear winter and the global ramifications of, if you're dealing that much damage to the planet, then you have a cascade of other consequences.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, nuclear winter is no joke. Like, what was the old saying in the 1980s? There was a report done on what a nuclear war would look like. And the famous line was, the living would envy the dead.
Mm-hmm.
So there wouldn't be much left. It wouldn't be fun. I would not recommend. 0
Or,
stars.
or the other quote that's passed around, which is, I don't know what World War III is going to be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah, the old Einstein quote.
Hmm.
Yeah, I did read, though, that the FSB agent who wrote that letter did mention that he thought that there was an outside possibility that Putin might use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Not so much in order to break the deadlock or make ground, but rather to try to pressure the West into giving concessions that would result in a favorable agreement with Ukraine.
That seems so backwards to me, because that would completely solidify him as a villain if he hasn't been solidified as that already.
Well, therein lies the rub. Like, if you're already most of the way there, why
Sunk
not take
cost
the last
fallacy,
step?
sunk cost fallacy, but for morals.
Kind of.
I'm already the wickedest man on earth, so what's stopping me from doing more wicked stuff?
Well, it's more cost benefit, right? It's more like the marginal cost of taking that last step is not as high.
Mm-hmm.
You've already got all of the penalties in the form of sanctions and Western support for your opponent. So if you do this one last thing, what else can they really do?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if you use tactical nuclear weapons, it's unlikely the West would intervene because the same problem would be present, the possibility of a nuclear exchange. So even in that extreme eventuality, there probably would not be Western intervention. And honestly, I don't entirely know what the West would do in that case. I might add that that's an extreme likelihood. I don't think the Russian government is likely to do that. But the letter in question does point it out as a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
To be fair, it also points out that the Russian government is not going to blow up the world over Ukraine. He points out that there are multiple people in the chain of command that a command for use of nuclear weapons would require to go through. So anything that could lead to World War III would probably be stopped at that stage,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere along that chain of command. Let's see. So just to kind of move through some other stuff here, there have been more and more reports of protests by Ukrainians in the cities that have already been taken by Russia. There was a really big one the other day in Kherson that had thousands of people in it, but also in some of the other places, smaller towns, whatnot. The Russians, for the most part, seem to be allowing them, but there have been a couple of reports of violence against the protesters. I think there was one reported from a city in the east, actually, which is a little weird. You wouldn't expect there to be a lot of anti-Russian protests in eastern Ukraine, but apparently there have been some. And apparently there were a couple people shot out there. But yeah, the protests just kind of illustrate how strong public opinion is. I think my favorite one thus far was the guy who jumped on top of a Russian APC waving a Ukrainian flag.
What's an APC?
Armored personnel carrier. That's like a BMP.
What's a BMP?
Well, that's a specific type of Russian APC.
You're
They're
saying
just
it's a truck.
it's not a truck. It's an armored vehicle designed to transport troops. It's kind of like the M2 Bradley almost. And Bradley's not the best example because it was kind of a weird Frankenstein's monster of multiple types of vehicles with multiple roles. But yeah, let's say the M113. It's more like the equivalent of that.
I have to troll you here. So it's a van?
It's a war van, yes.
Okay, great.
Or maybe more like a taxi. I think I've seen it described as that. It's like a combat taxi for transporting infantry. So the Russians have always produced a lot of those, and there's a lot of them in Ukraine right now being used by both sides. And I think either this was a Russian BMP or it may have been a Russian BMP that was hijacked by protesters. I think I did read one tweet suggesting that was the case. But regardless, it was just kind of humorous to see a guy with a Ukrainian flag just kind of riding on top of it. But yeah, we can probably expect to see more protests going forward, and I'm still kind of watching to see just how the Russian government responds to those. Let's see. So some items about Russian morale. There were some reports of desertions in the Russian army in the first couple days, but I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to them because I thought, okay, that's either isolated incidents or it's propaganda. So it's probably not going to be that big a deal. But then in the past week, there have been more reports about it, and they've been increasingly credible. So there was a couple of conscripts that basically just picked up and walked away. And we do have like video footage of that. And then there was also a lot of communication, radio communications that were observed and recorded that suggested that there was some Russian soldiers who were not obeying commands to bombard cities, or at least not doing so before civilians had had a chance to evacuate. And there was also apparently one case of Russian soldiers shooting at each other. That was gleaned from radio chatter that was observed by a company that has been a contract company that has been paid to do so. I think it's an OSINT company or something. And then there's also been reports of soldiers complaining about a lack of supplies, a lack of food, a lack of ammo, etc. There's been a lot of confusion, it seems, as well, from what we've gleaned from radio chatter. And then again, there's also more video and accounts of Russian soldiers abandoning positions, abandoning vehicles, and seemingly just walking back to Russia or walking back to headquarters, whatever the main base for their unit is. There's more accounts of that as well. So whether those are conscripts that are just shocked that they're actually fighting in a war and don't want to be there, or if those are regular soldiers who are just opposed to the war in general and want to leave, that's not clear. That's we've still got a lot of fog of war on that account. But what we know is that a non-insignificant, what was it? What's the word I want? A non-trivial number of Russian soldiers have been walking away from the war thus far. Let's say that. The extent remains to be seen, and whether or not it continues into the future remains to be seen. But it has been happening to some extent thus far, and that's worth keeping an eye on. Let's see. I also wanted to just point something out here. I know that there's kind of always been a debate about the quality of the Russian military. And so there are people who criticize it and say it's not nearly as strong as people think it is and that it's much weaker. And those people are frequently accused of being just anti-Russian or being Western chauvinists, of having a high opinion of Western militaries and just trying to kind of eschew and downplay the capabilities of other militaries. So those people do exist, but then there's also people who have been big fans of the Russian military who always take a very rosy uh, review of the Russian military's capabilities and kind of downplay problems that the Russian military has had. So what we've been seeing in some of the analytical community and amongst some of the, armchair general community, in so much as they're different, is that they're arguing with each other about how to interpret events. And so you'll see lots of different accounts from one side or the other, basically trying to interpret the underperformance of the Russian military thus far. And the fact that we have these different perspectives illustrates that it's just inherently difficult to kind of read what's been happening thus far and to draw accurate conclusions. And there are people who are objective, who are trying to be professional and tap professional sources and expertise and whatnot. But you've also got this sort of armchair general debate happening in the background as well. That's also kind of filling out some people's tweets and whatnot. So just be wary of some of the analysis out there. Not all of it is entirely objective, and so that's also kind of, I don't want to say poisoning the well, so to speak, but uh, I don't know. I would just say be aware that that debate is happening and that some people are very biased in one way or the other in terms of how they interpret events on the ground with regard to the Russian military. I've tried to account for that in my own reading of what's been happening, but it's just inherently hard because it's hard to find one, accurate information about what's actually happening, and then two, objective analysis from experts. Again, I've tried to kind of caveat the information that I get from Twitter because, it's Twitter, like it could be anybody. I think even the link you sent me, Neuro, that translates that FSB letter.
Mm.
The guy whose Twitter account that posted that is actually a race car driver. He speaks Russian, I think, so he was able to translate the letter, but he himself, I don't believe, is like a member of the OSINT community or otherwise has military experience. Or at least if he does, he didn't mention any on his Twitter account. He just mentions that he races cars for a living. So you kind of have to be wary about who you're getting information from. And I'm trying to be very cognizant of that and factoring that in to my own analysis here as far as what information I'm using.
Chad
Let's
did
see.
link me a quick image of the BTR, so now I know what it looks like. It's basically a tank with wheels instead of treads and no big gun.
Not a tank.
It's not a tank, but
Not a tank.
the body shape is similar. where it's kind of low to the ground, pretty chonky, kind of like a turtle, and it's really heavily armored. It doesn't look like a van or a truck.
Well, BMPs are different than BTRs.
Oh,
Like a BMP, unless I'm just making things up. Yeah, BMP. That is a thing. So that's one type, and then BTR is another one. Yeah, I'm not crazy. I knew I was remembering it. So, yeah, that's a tank is like a very specific type of vehicle. It has treads and it has a main gun. And it's designed for specifically penetrating enemy defenses and fighting other tanks. Um, a BTR or a BMP is just purely a taxi. It's just meant to act as a transport. Sometimes they'll have some heavy weaponry equipped, but it's not anything like what you would see on a tank. Like a main gun has to be powerful enough to penetrate another tank's armor, or at least to penetrate armor on vehicles. BTRs and BMPs don't really have that, or equivalent vehicles in the Western inventory.
oh, interesting thing just about the last week's episode. They age restricted the last week's Agent Smith, so you have to be 18 plus and log in with your YouTube account to watch it.
Really?
I'm not sure if it was just because it was Ukraine invasion content or because we watched some videos. There wasn't anything that was graphic violence in them, which I have to be careful about on Twitch anyway, but yeah, that was the thing. I'm not upset about that. It's just that's never happened in my videos before.
Was that on YouTube or on Twitch?
YouTube.
YouTube. Okay. That doesn't surprise me. They probably got an algorithm sort of trawling for anything related to Ukraine and then flagging it. So I guess I should have expected that, but still,
Not
I
a big
would have
deal.
hoped. Yeah, yeah, but still, I would have hoped that they would have been better. I guess I can't blame them either, though, because there's just so much content out there to moderate. So they're probably having to take cast a wide net, so to speak. Well, I'll try to keep things PG, relatively speaking.
Oh, that's all
So
good.
much,
The
so
majority
much
of my
as I
audience
can.
is between 25 and 35.
Oh, no kids?
Not that many. I say fuck too many times.
That puts them off, huh?
Eh. Also, I play games for millennials that were made 10 years ago, so the chances of them getting into StarCraft 2 or World of Warcraft Classic are comparatively lower than, say, if I was a Fortnite streamer. I think if you're a Fortnite streamer or a Minecraft streamer, you get a whole bunch of kids who watch your stuff. If you're in the chat and I guess you have to be 16 to make a Twitch account. You could share your age if you're comfortable with doing so, but my analytics tell me that vast majority are between 25 and 35.
That's right. Yeah, I forget sometimes that StarCraft 2 is about 10 years old now. Time flies.
We have some people who are 69, some people who are 420.
69. Wow.
It's the sex number. They're just joking, dude.
Oh.
You're so pure, man.
I should have known.
Oh, chat, you got him.
I
He's
don't spend
down. He's hit.
I don't spend enough time online, I guess. All right, I deserved that. Well, let's see. What else did we have here? I was going to mention that among the countries sending weapons to Ukraine now include Finland, Luxembourg, and Japan. So those are not countries that generally jump into stuff like this. Especially Luxembourg. You wouldn't think they would have much to offer, but what little they have, they're giving.
Yeah, I saw Japan was giving bulletproof vests and also accepting refugees, which was kind of weird since they don't usually look super favorably upon immigration. But yeah, that was a big move by them to welcome Ukrainians who need to flee. They probably won't get a ton. That's pretty far from Ukraine, but
Yeah.
Still a nice gesture.
Yeah, and I saw a post on Reddit. Apparently, Poland is not going to subject Ukrainian refugees to the same kinds of, or maybe it was the Netherlands. I don't remember. There was a country in Europe that had been applying a tax to refugees that came from the Middle East. Basically, it was called like a jewelry tax, and it basically required them to hand over jewelry and other sort of valuables that they brought with them. And they're not going to apply that to the Ukrainian refugees. So some people online were a little upset with that for obvious reasons. I think the justification from the government in question given was that Ukrainians, was that Europe had a special duty to Ukrainians, given the context of their conflict. Let's see. I already kind of mentioned that we don't have the full picture of what's happening on the ground, so just keep an open mind as to analysis that you read. It's very fluid on the ground, so we don't really know what to expect, and we're not really going to be able to predict how the conflict goes in the next couple days to the next week. So just kind of be ready for anything in a sense. And there was a guy on Twitter, and I think he's a legit analyst, but he made an interesting point that I wanted to kind of convey here. And he said that the some of the assumptions and operations that the Russians have been conducting kind of reminded him of the Battle of Grozny in 1994, in the sense that there was a lot of bad organization and bad decisions and various sorts of blunders and whatnot. And the Russians ended up winning that battle in the end, eventually, but it was enormously costly. But there's some strong parallels there in terms of organizational incompetence. And then he noted that sending, I guess I could just read the quote here, sending airborne air assault brigades or naval infantry in early on to do quote unquote their thing, even though it's unnecessary, risky, or impractical, end quote. So there may have been a sense on the part of some branches of the Russian military that the war was kind of an opportunity to do something, to participate, and that may have led paratroopers and naval infantry to be assigned missions that were not entirely necessary or even necessarily well played out, basically just so that they could get a piece of the action. So in that sense, that may account for some of the poor planning on their part. But yeah, just some of the elements here are not unprecedented. Some of the weaknesses that the Russian military has shown organizationally have precedent going back to Chechnya. So I thought that was worth mentioning here. Let's see. Oh, I thought this was some interesting trivia. You may appreciate this. So I mentioned last time that the city of Konotop had been surrounded and bypassed by the Russians and that it was under siege. It still is, even a week later. And apparently, what happened is that the Russians asked the garrison there to surrender. And the mayor of Konotop held a citizens' assembly in order to vote on that. And apparently, the public there voted decisively to not surrender. So that's to their credit. They're definitely going to suffer for it, but they're showing some bravery here in the face of pretty extreme adversity. I thought it was also worth mentioning that there was a large units of infantry that were spotted and videoed in the Battle of Kherson in the south. And that suggests that the Russians are kind of getting better about dismounting their infantry uh, to protect and provide support for armored vehicles as well as to take territory. So they're either learning or they're just fighting better in general. Regardless, they're going to be more effective now that they're doing that, if that is indeed something they're doing across the country and not just in this one isolated location. That's an improvement from last week. I kind of made a list of stuff that was just sort of weird and that hadn't really been explained yet. I kind of already mentioned the Russian Air Force and how it's kind of MIA. Also, there's not really that many Russian drones that have been used, which is kind of something people had really been expecting. That was supposed to be one of their big advantages. But instead, it seems that the Ukrainians have kind of been getting more use out of their drone fleet. Bulk of forces still in Belarus / North Ukraine. The distribution of Russian forces in Ukraine seems to be heavily weighted in the north, and it's not entirely clear why that is either. Um, I mean, as evidence, you could say that it suggests they were going for a quick decapitation strike on the capital, or at least that they want to make the capital a priority. But that still doesn't explain fully why there hasn't been more support for some of the other axes of advance in Ukraine. Ukrainian communications networks are still up. One of the expectations beforehand, or at least in the early days of the invasion, is that the Russians would basically shut down the broader part of Ukraine's communications networks to make it more difficult for people to talk to each other, to convey information about Russian troop movements, as well as to limit the outside world's exposure to the conflict. As is, that hasn't happened and still hasn't happened, and experts don't really entirely seem to know why. So that's another open question here. One theory that I read is that the Russians themselves need that communications network because their own comms are not really up to the task. So that's possible. Uh, there's been a general lack of Russian electronic warfare in general. That's also inexplicable. You know, you would think that they would be acting more to jam enemy communications, jam radar, etc. We haven't really seen a whole lot of that. Let's see. Ukrainian Air Force not destroyed on the ground on the first day. That's still a mystery. You would think that would have been you'd think that would have been a high priority. There was a war game done by the U.S. Marines a couple weeks ago, sort of when the conflict looked like it might happen but hadn't broken out yet. And what they found is that, well, what the Russian player did in the war game is to really focus hard on Ukrainian air assets. But what the Russians ended up doing is sort of distributing their precision ranged fires against a range of targets, not only including Ukrainian air assets, but also intelligence, the intelligence agency, the command and control network, let's just say that, as well as other like things like airfields and strategic assets. So as a result, they kind of watered down their attack on Ukrainian air assets to the point where it didn't really do enough damage to put them out of action. And really, it probably watered down the amount of damage that it did against any specific type of target in general. You know, they really probably should have picked a specific category and focused on it. If it hadn't been so truncated, if they had bombarded Ukraine for longer, they would have had time to do all of them, basically. But as was, they really did not spend very much time bombarding Ukraine beforehand, and as a result, they didn't really do a lot of damage, or at least didn't do as much as they really probably needed to in order to really inhibit resistance. Let's see. So one guy noted, and I give this is just something I pulled off and wrote in my notes here. There was one analyst who noted that Russian industry has trouble mass producing their most modern equipment. And he cited this as a possible explanation for why they had not been using their most advanced assets. So they have a new type of tank called the Armada, and they have some new types of aircraft that are very, modern, if not cutting edge. And we haven't really seen those, near as I can tell. And so there's also some other more modern types of equipment they have in their inventory that hasn't really been spotted yet. So it could be that they're afraid of losing them in combat because the lack of industrial capacity means that they will not be able to easily replace them. So that's one theory anyway. Again, this is speculation. A lot of this is thus far, and I apologize, but this is just the best that I've been able to kind of gather together. Let's see. There was also a theory that they might be afraid to use their best assets for fear of causing Western intervention. So if that's true, that would suggest there's an opening for the West to intervene because they may not respond with nuclear weapons, even if the West intervenes. That's kind of convoluted logic, but basically, you would think that they would go all in early and then rely on, well, I guess I'm kind of chasing my tail here. I might have to come back to that. But short version is that they might be holding those resources back as deterrence against Western intervention. Let's just go with that for now. Let's see. Most of the I already said that, mentioned that. Yeah, I guess that's the end of the list there. Let's see, and we mentioned that. And it's worth mentioning that the Ukrainians are doing their own fair share of electronic warfare. They've been jamming Russian radio uh, communications in order to try to inhibit operations as much as possible. And from what I read, one of the things that they're playing over Russian radio is a sort of rock song version of their national anthem, which isn't really that relevant, but I thought that was just a cool detail. Let's see. In Russia, they started blocking Twitter, Facebook, and they were talking about possibly blocking Wikipedia due to Wikipedia having, an up-to-date article about all the stuff going on, including some of the aspects that the Russian government doesn't want reported in Russia. So I don't know if they've done that yet, but the last time I checked, they were threatening to do so. Wikipedia's article on this is actually like surprisingly up to date. like anytime something new happens, they put it in there. So it's kind of like this. They're creating the article for the war in real time,
Mm.
which they've done before, but is still just kind of weird to watch.
Yep, as we move forward in time, each conflict or event is more reported on with more detailed information than any before it, which is kind of surreal when you're not just hearing about things secondhand, you can see a bunch of videos and such.
We talked about that. Oh, as far as Russian desertions, there was some evidence that some of the conscripts were puncturing the gas tanks in their vehicles in order to have an excuse not to go to the front. And there's an allegation, as yet unverified, that some troops in Crimea just outright refused to participate in the invasion. Let's see. Talk about that. And there was some similar drama with Belarus. Belarus is allowing the Russians to use their territory as a staging ground for the invasion, but at the same time, they themselves are not participating, specifically the Belarusian military. There was some talk earlier this week that the Belarusian government would get involved and would send their military in, but nothing came of that. And there's some suspicion, and there's been some allegations that officers, as well as military personnel in general in the Belarusian military, are either deserting or are refusing any orders to get involved, and that this has perhaps led the Belarusian government to refuse to send in its army. Again, there's not much that's really been verified on that count, but it would at least explain why the Belarusian military hasn't jumped in here yet. There was also a video I saw on Twitter of a guy who said that he was a retired Belarusian paratrooper. And he was saying that the war was wrong and that the propagandists had been lying about the casus belli for the war and that the whole thing was bullshit and that his fellow Belarusian paratroopers should not get involved. And that there was more to the video than just that, but that was sort of the gist of it. So that also kind of lends some credence to this idea that people in the Belarusian military are opposed to the war, and that their opposition may be influencing Belarusian foreign policy on this. Let's see, pro-war sentiment in Russia. There's a lot of that. Um, there was a guy who asked an academic in Russia, like his perception of what the opinion was of academics, and his letter in response suggested that about half of academics in Russia are anti-war explicitly, and then the other half are kind of a mix of pro-war or people who kind of don't like the war but partially blame NATO for it. So kind of in between, but more pro-war. So that just kind of illustrates that even amongst sort of the intellectual class in Russia, there's still a lot of pro-war sentiment, or at least people who are skeptical of Western accounts of what's happening. And there's again sort of more and more reports of people decorating like their vehicles and their office spaces with the Z symbol that's come to be associated with the Russian war effort.
Because that's what's the marking on their tanks and stuff and planes.
Yeah, yeah. That's I'm still not entirely sure what that's supposed to symbolize. One guy online I saw on Twitter was suggesting that it was meant to designate where the units were coming from, and that units with different variants of the Z symbol reflected units from like Crimea or Belgrade, or not Belgrade, Belgorod, or from Belarus or what have you. Also, I've read that it's a deconfliction device. Basically, they just want to have a symbol on there that shows that the vehicle is Russian and not Ukrainian, since they use a lot of the same kinds of vehicles. But it's also now become a political symbol that has been embraced by Russian nationalists. And I already mentioned that a lot of people are buying into the propaganda, or at least are not challenging it to the point where even having a daughter in a city that's being bombed is not enough to change your mind. So there's just a lot of pro-war sentiment. That's sort of the takeaway here. I just kind of want to underline that. So don't think that there's going to be like a mass uprising against the government over this. If there's going to be an uprising, it would be more likely to stem from economic dislocation than outrage over the war.
Well, people are getting fined and arrested and thrown in jail for protesting. It's super strict in the response to it, so it's also hard to read what the sentiment actually is and how many people are really opposed to it, because if you speak out against it, you put yourself at risk.
That's true, but to kind of metagame it a little bit, in general, the working class in a country tends to be the most nationalist,
Mm.
and generally upper middle class and students, specifically college students, tend to be more liberal. So Russia has a pretty decent sized middle class, but it definitely hews more towards the working class rather than the upper middle class.
Mm.
So it would not surprise me if there was majority support for the war thus far. And really, even if the government told the truth about the war and what's happening, there would probably still be a lot of support for it. You know, Russia has always had a lot of nationalist sentiment in its politics. So maybe if the war goes bad, or if the economic sanctions bite to the point where people are seriously inconvenienced or have their livelihood undermined, maybe then there would be some bigger protests, or maybe the government would feel sufficiently threatened that it would change policy in Ukraine. But in the short to medium term, I would not predict that. I suspect that the government will either have explicit support from the public or, at the very least, passivity.
The sanctions are hitting the average person reasonably hard. If you're someone who's even just like a Russian gamer kind of a person, a lot of game companies are pulling out. PayPal is out. A lot of Microsoft and Visa are also pulling out. So it's creating major changes for them, which I think can raise some questions. But on the propaganda side, you can always spin that as well. They're just against us, and they've been the villains all along. And a lot of the who is the hero, who is the villain, can be controlled by the information that you give people. And if they don't have equal access to the information that's critical of the war, and they have really easy access to the stuff that's favorable to the war, if they're the kind of person who just reads news for a little bit in the day, it looks like things are going well and we're on the right side of history, so to speak. You're not giving the news a fair shot.
Yeah. Yeah, so they're going to be pretty skeptical of challenges to that official narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So I don't expect a lot of progress on that. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but I don't expect it. I think there would have to be a dramatic change in order to instigate that. Let's see. We mentioned earlier that the Ukrainians are doing a lot of raiding in the Russian rear, specifically targeting their logistical train. They also seem to be getting involved in some assassinations. Maybe I shouldn't call them assassinations. They're legitimate targets. But in the past week, there were 3 high-ranking Russian officers who were killed by snipers, presumably Ukrainian snipers. And that was pretty surprising to hear. Normally, those guys kind of stay in the rear in order to kind of organize and lead. But there were some officers that tried to travel to the front. And from what I read, the speculation is they traveled to the front in order to try to unclog, let's say, the logistical clusterfuck that is, north of Kiev right now. And apparently, it was while they were out trying to do that that they were targeted and killed. Yeah, one of them was the lieutenant. I don't remember the rank, but he was a division commander, I think, of some paratroopers, something like that. Pretty high ranking. I was actually genuinely surprised to see somebody that high up um, be killed, let alone make himself that vulnerable. Or the other way around, make himself that vulnerable, let alone actually be killed. Let's see, I already talked about reinforcements and yeah, the FSB letter. So I kind of took some highlights here. We already talked about this a little bit, so I'll skip the stuff we already mentioned. So this guy who allegedly is a member of the FSB and wrote this whistleblower letter, he says that Russia might have to withdraw from Syria because of the closing of the Bosphorus Strait and the logistical snags caused by the Ukraine war. They may just not have enough supplies available to continue supplying Russian forces there, and that may lead them to leave Syria, either temporarily or permanently. And he speculated that the West would remove Assad and that they would look, quote unquote, like idiots. His words, not mine. Uh, he didn't think, I already mentioned that he didn't think Russia would mobilize because its full forces would strain the nation's economy, politics, and society. Kind of mentioned that before. He also said that Russia was totally unprepared for sanctions. Again, nobody on top told anybody below that this was going to happen, and so there was no substantive preparation. So, if true, that would explain part of the effectiveness of the sanctions thus far. You would think they would have been better prepared for that. Also, they weren't expecting resistance. I already mentioned that. He also said that the Russian economy had months before nothing was left and that there was a conditional deadline of June. Make of that what you will. He was a little ambiguous about that. Let's see, I already mentioned that. Oh, I already mentioned that. Mentioned the nukes. Got that. Yeah, I guess we got most of this earlier as independent topics came up. Oh, he also mentioned that he expected a world famine because Ukraine and Russia produce so much of the world's grain. That's almost certainly oversold, though. I have a hard time seeing that. There's lots of substitute crops that can pick up the slack there, so I doubt that'll happen. Although I would mention here, one of the data points I saw online was that Egypt imports something like 80 to 90% of its grain from Russia and Ukraine. So Egypt in particular could have a problem going forward if grain exports are disrupted from Russia and Ukraine. But it remains to be seen how likely that is. At the very least, they're experiencing problems from rises in the price of grains, which has already happened. He also mentions that even if they were able to assassinate President Zelensky now, it wouldn't change anything because the population has basically mobilized to the point that they're just not going to quit fighting. Their morale is high. They're anti-Russian to a degree that isn't going to easily go away. So assassinating Zelensky at this point is just kind of too late in the game to really impact the will to resist amongst the broader population. If anything, it would just make him a martyr.
Yeah, I talked about that last week a little bit too, where he's pretty much already won the moral victory by staying in the country. I think the way that he could have lost the moral victory would be if war starts and he leaves. That would demoralize the Ukrainian people a lot because it's like, oh, well, if he left, then he doesn't believe that we can win. But by staying, it kind of represents that he thinks there's a chance that they can survive there.
Yeah. And he mentioned too that they might have tried that they were going to try to take Kiev quickly, remove Zelensky, either kill him or just force him at gunpoint to basically sign an agreement capitulating. And then at that point, maybe resistance would have been relatively minimal and they could have gotten what they wanted. But as is, that's not how things panned out.
Mm-hmm.
It's also worth mentioning here in this letter, and I've also seen this in some other places too, corroborating this. The Russian government is trying to create a narrative, basically, justifying the war by saying that Ukraine was trying to develop dirty bombs, that is to say, dirty nuclear bombs, with the assistance of the United States. And they actually did try this. There is They released a statement saying that they'd found a laptop, a NATO laptop in Donbass that had been recovered from a captured Ukrainian headquarters or base or some such, and that it had evidence that there was a dirty bomb being developed. If you don't know what a dirty bomb is, that's just a nuclear weapon that is designed to not kill people. Well, it's designed to kill people rather than destroy property. So it's not a bomb like a nuclear bomb with a nuclear explosion, but rather it just releases a lot of radiation in order to try to injure or kill people in a given area. There was a lot of talk about dirty bombs in the war on terror that the United States fought back in the day. And that was a pretty regular feature of the justification for the invasion of Iraq. And, once again, I would point out it was obvious bullshit then. I don't know why they would just copy paste the same thing now and expect people to be any less incredulous. And as a side note here, another item in this guy's letter that I thought was really interesting, but isn't necessarily related to the current war. He mentioned that the war in the Donbass in 2014 was actually a distraction. He said that Russia didn't do it specifically because they wanted Ukraine. They said they did it in order to give themselves leverage in negotiations over Crimea. So basically, they seized Crimea and might have just seized Crimea itself without doing anything else, but then they wouldn't have had leverage in order to trade something to get the West to accept the seizure. So they started the war in Donbass so that they could trade away Donbass in exchange for Crimea. That was sort of what he was asserting here, or at least that was my takeaway. And that was pretty surprising to me because I'd always gotten the impression that Donbass was just part of the same operation as Crimea, but this letter would suggest otherwise. He goes on to suggest that Turkey moving into Syria, among other things that happened around the same time, ended up scuppering that. They didn't end up having the necessary leverage to make that work. And so that plan had to be abandoned, and so they kind of just got stuck with Donbass. So I would add here that I can't verify this guy's letter. I can't say for sure that he's an FSB agent and that everything he's saying is an accurate portrayal of what's happening. And I would point out, too, that even the Bellingcat executive who posted this said that his contacts in the FSB said that they did not agree with all of the assessments and conclusions that this guy's letter has. So keep that in mind when you assess this, but this is a data point here, and there's definitely some, meaty information here to process, but it has to come with an asterisk. Okay, so moving on from that, there was some other speculation online that Putin may cause a humanitarian crisis as leverage. It may be that if the Russian army does just get bogged down and is unable to progress substantively going forward, they may double down on attacking cities and whatnot and causing civilian deaths just as a way to try to pressure the West into giving concessions and pressuring Ukraine into a more favorable peace agreement. The idea being that the West would be concerned about refugees and would want, out of concern for the humanitarian situation, to try to minimize civilian casualties. This is obviously not a very flattering take for the Russian military or for the Russian government, so I can't say how accurate this is. But hypothetically, if the Russian government were really, really desperate, this is something that they could do. This is a card they could play. So I'm not going to say whether or not they're going to do it, or I'll say that I don't think they're doing it now, but I can't rule it out completely in the future. Again, this would be a desperation move, but this is a card they could play. And there was another Bellingcat guy who was saying that he thought that the invasion force, specifically the invasion force as it was constituted just before the war, specifically referring here to the forces that had been aggregated on the border of Ukraine for the invasion, these forces and the supplies that they had at the start of the war, this guy predicts will be expended by March the 6th, by Sunday, which is today. So he says that their supplies are going to have run out as of today, Sunday, and that they're going to have to resupply from other sources going forward. So that suggests, hypothetically anyway, that the Russians were not expecting this to last as long as it has, or if they were expecting it to last as long as it has, they were not expecting to expend as much fuel or ammunition as they've had to. So that lends further evidence to the impromptu invasion theory that they really weren't planning for this for very long, or that they were not expecting nearly as much, that they were making rosy assumptions about how it would play out. But again, this is just a theory on the part of a Bellingcat investigator, so make of that what you will. This would kind of tie into the video evidence of the trucks being loaded onto trains and shipped out. You know, all the buses and other civilian vehicles being sent to Ukraine, or that we think are being sent to Ukraine anyway. That would kind of tie into that and lend credence to it. But again, still unclear at this point. Oh, the guy. Okay, I did have the guy's name who was killed. The high-ranking Russian officer who was killed by a Ukrainian sniper, or one of them anyway. One of the three was. His name was Andrei Sukhavetsky, and he was the commanding general of the Russian 7th Airborne Division and a deputy commander of the 41st Combat Arms Army. And apparently, he's by far the most senior Russian figure to have died in the conflict thus far. So let's see, that's about all I had for the general stuff. Are we still doing okay on time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
At 25 minutes.
gotcha. Okay, so as far as updating on the combat that's happening, in the eastern part of Ukraine, there's still heavy fighting around Severodonetsk. The Russians seem to have been hung up around the city, so they haven't really been advancing there. But that big push that started in northern Luhansk has continued to advance west. So the Ukrainians either are not stopping them or have been unable to stop them. And it seems like they're pushing towards the Dnieper River. The northeastern part of Ukraine, the cities of Kharkiv, Sumy, Konotop, and Chernihiv continue to hold out. The Ukrainian government actually gave these cities the status of hero cities, which is a status that is given to cities that basically undergo great hardship and during war. I don't know if you may be, those of you familiar with the Eastern Front will be familiar with hero cities, because there was a number of cities that survived, well, almost survived anyway, long sieges during the war. Most of them ended up falling, but I think Leningrad was the only one that did not. But regardless, all of them suffered terribly and had garrisons that fought for months before being overwhelmed. So the Ukrainian government, a little early in my opinion, but regardless, after the first week and a half here, the Ukrainian government has given this award to these cities that have managed to hold out against the Russian offensive. So let's see, that's northeastern Ukraine. There was also a Russian push that started in northeastern Ukraine that was pushing west towards a city called Okhtirsk. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Uh, they have continued to fail to push past Okhtirsk. Ukrainian defenders have managed to stop that advance from continuing. There was another Russian advance that started in the northeast that has made much more progress, and they've actually come pretty close to Kiev now. And if they do link up with Russian forces to the north of Kiev, they would cut off, in effect, Ukrainian forces defending the city of Chernihiv. So that's something to watch now. I'm not sure if the Ukrainians have launched a counteroffensive there or if they're even able to, but certainly they're going to have to do something pretty soon there. Oh, I should also mention here that there was a Ukrainian counteroffensive that was launched around Kharkiv, and allegedly it pushed a Russian unit back to the border. But I can't really verify that. I know that at the very least there was a Ukrainian counteroffensive reported, and there was some success there, but it doesn't seem to have changed the overall strategic disposition out there. So that's the northeast. And the southwest, the city of Kherson, the city of Kherson fell, and the Russians have been pushing northwest from there into a city called Mykolaiv, and currently the battle there is ongoing. There was also a push north towards Inerdar. I have a hard time saying it. It's the city that had. It is a city that has a nuclear reactor. It's not the big one in Zaporizhia. That was a separate thing. There was a separate prong of the Russian offensive that pushed up there. But there's another prong that's pushing to the Dnieper River around Inner Donetsk. If somebody in chat, please correct me on that. I don't have it in my notes here, but there's been some fighting there as well. And then there was, oh, so it's worth mentioning here that the push north from Crimea is experiencing an operational pause right now. So for the past day or two, they haven't really been doing a whole lot. But over the course of the past week, they've made pretty substantive gains. And then I already mentioned that. Okay, so then in the southeast, forces from Crimea moved up north, and they've almost succeeded in surrounding the city of Mariupol. I haven't really noticed Russian forces pushing west out of Donetsk, so that seems to be still a relatively quiet part of the front. But this Russian force coming up from Mount Crimea is definitely making gains, and it looks like they're going to focus on laying siege to Mariupol now. I haven't seen too much progress in the force that was pushing northeast from Crimea. I imagine they're also subject to the operational pause. Let's see. And in the north around Kiev, there's just been heavy fighting all week around the suburb of Irpin. There's not much of the city left. I mean, a lot of the footage of destroyed apartments and buildings and whatnot has been coming out of that specific area, and the Russians have been shelling it pretty hard. There was some good news for the Ukrainians in that they were able to successfully retake Halaska or Halaskova airfield. So it was kind of surprising to see them pull that off, but that was a gain on their part. That's northwest of Kiev. So let's see. So there was that, and we've only got about 20 minutes, so I'll jump into the miscellaneous stuff. I could do with more time to organize the sanctions. I've got it in presentable form, but there's more stuff that I could put in. I would point out that one of the effects of the sanctions here is that Apple Pay, as well as other payment platforms, have basically stopped servicing the market. And one of the impacts was that people at the Moscow metro could not pay. And so there were big long lines of people having to pay with cash or having to pay with alternative means. Let's see. So miscellaneous stuff. What did we have here? There was a mayor of a city in Ukraine that tried to hand over the city to the Russians. He was not able to successfully do so, but he was shot for well, he was arrested. I don't have any. My notes say that he was arrested, but I could have sworn that I read somewhere that he was shot for doing so. There's been an increasing number of saboteurs who have been arrested, and some of them have been killed by the Ukrainian intelligence service. Let's see. Yeah, we talked about that last week. There was 11, I think. 11 rapes were reported by Russian forces, perpetrated by Russian forces in the city of Kherson this past week. I haven't heard any other reports to that effect. And I can't entirely verify this report because it came, I think, from Ukrainian sources. So I don't know that there's much evidence besides this report, but that has been something I've been watching for. So that could be something that we see more of going forward. That's kind of just always a part of war. But, in ugly wars in particular, in which kind of ethnic conflict and whatnot is a feature, you tend to see that. There was a Turkish woman trapped in Kharkiv who said that she would fight if she can't get out. There's a number of foreign students who are kind of trapped in Ukraine right now. And most of them have tried to get out, but some of them just can't. And this woman was notable because she said that she would actually fight. I don't know how many foreign students are doing that, but she certainly seems to be pretty gung-ho. There was also another story about a video actually from a Chinese student who was upset about how how people on Chinese social media are treating the conflict. A lot of them have been very pro-Russian and have kind of been very gung-ho about Russia conquering Ukraine. And there's been some rather flippant remarks on Chinese social media about how Ukrainian women were welcome in China because they were sexy. And so this Chinese student in Ukraine posted a video basically condemning them and bitching them out and saying that a lot of Chinese students are kind of getting a bad reputation on account of it. And he even at one point asserted that there had been one Chinese student who had been shot. he didn't specify the context for that, but he kind of implied that people in Ukraine were very upset about the stuff that they were hearing about on Chinese social media. Because it's been reported, people in Ukraine have reported goings on Chinese social media vis-a-vis Ukraine, so people know about it. And just because people are upset about that, some Chinese students are kind of being, I don't want to say abused per se, but they're not exactly being welcomed either. And this guy is stuck too, so he's kind of getting the worst of it with other people in Ukraine, and so he has to kind of worry about this as well, and he doesn't particularly appreciate it. Let's see, I had some videos that you might be interested in at least. One of them was a drive-by Molotoving of a Russian vehicle. I'll send that to you, I guess, in Discord.
Mm-hmm.
Send that. Oh, God. I have to post it in Notepad first. Notepad, copy, Discord. There we go. So this is actually a Russian vehicle being towed, and I'm not sure who it's being towed by. Hypothetically, it may even be towed by Ukrainians, but it would be kind of weird. But regardless, these guys in a car drive by this Russian vehicle, and as they're driving by, they just Molotov cocktail it. Let's see, as far as refugees, as of last Monday, the number was 500,000, and that's expected to get around 1 or 2 million in the coming weeks. So big numbers. I mean, it's just a stat, but it just illustrates just how big this crisis is getting. And then there's this asshole from Texas. This guy. I actually remember this guy from 2014. I remember seeing videos of him. I may even have mentioned him at one point on here.
He's
a
the guy who
from
joined
Tex
the Russians?
Yeah, he's a communist Texan who traveled to the Donbass in 2014 to fight with the separatists because he thought they were fighting Nazis. And there was actually a new video of him recently, and apparently he's with the Russian forces north of Kiev. And I don't think he's fighting, but he was talking basically trash about the Ukrainians and how they were going to liberate Ukraine and all this kind of bullshit. So I had a video of that as well if you want to see that.
That person seems very confused.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And then I also have a link to the video from 2014 from the Vice documentary crew who was interviewing him. Again, for those, go ahead.
I'll post these in the Neuro Discord. We have a Russia-Ukraine tension thread that is going, that's kind of a subset of the general chat.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, well, we didn't want the general chat to be just all war talk the whole time.
Yeah, understandable. But yeah, for those of you who maybe still don't understand, the Russian government right now is definitely a conservative right-wing government. It's not, for all of the accusations they throw around about Nazism in Ukraine, it's not as though Russia doesn't have their fair share.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly invading another country because you see them as a subject people, that's more Nazi than I think anything Ukraine has done over the past 10 years. And I'm not going to downplay, like, there has been Nazi stuff in Ukraine, Azov Battalion and whatnot being preeminent examples.
Yeah, someone in chat just asked about that a few minutes ago.
Yeah, that's a real thing. That was a volunteer battalion of far-right people who went to fight the separatists back in 2014. I don't think they really still exist. There is still a Azov battalion in the Ukrainian army, but I don't think it's still an all-volunteer force. I think it's been sort of rolled into the broader regular force.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of the original members have been either distributed into other units or have since retired.
Mm-hmm.
And it's worth pointing out that successive governments, the Poroshenko government and the Zelensky government, have tried to mitigate the influence of Nazis in the Ukrainian army as well as the Ukrainian government. They had a hard time doing it in the early years because they just didn't have enough institutional capacity, but they definitely got better about it over time. Let's see. Here's a video of a guy in Kharkiv. And I guess this falls under the category of evidence that Kharkiv is being bombarded by Russians. This is a guy who was driving in Kharkiv and basically he just got caught up in the middle of some shelling. The original video suggested it was mortar fire, which is possible. It's not entirely clear. So it's either mortar fire or shelling, possibly Grads. I think the explosions are too small for Grads, though. And I guess this is just kind of jokey trivia, but the Ukrainian government came out, and you may have mentioned this last week, but Ukrainian government clarified that citizens don't need to put Russian trophy vehicles in their tax declaration. So war booty is tax-free, it seems. Let's see. The European Union approved Ukraine's application to join. That's probably not going to go anywhere. That's not the same thing as accepting them. So I think people kind of blew that out of proportion. I don't think they're going to give them any kind of fast track to membership. Oh, I really liked this. So somebody in Ukraine made a music video celebrating their Bayraktar drones that they buy from Turkey that have been one of their principal assets in the war thus far. It's actually surprisingly catchy. And I guess this kind of falls into the category of trivia, but I just found it really sad. There was a 19-year-old biathlete whom I believe had competed in the Olympics just recently, named Yevgeny Malyshev, and she was apparently killed in battle near Kharkov recently. And let's see, we already talked about the radio chatter. Oh no, this is okay. This is specific radio chatter. There was a recording of some radio chatter between Ukrainians and Russians because they can use the same channels and they basically just I don't even know how to describe it. Basically, they were just bitching each other out.
Talk shit.
Yeah, there you go. So the dialogue is, I don't know, it's not substantive, but it is just somewhat humorous. So I thought I'd just share that as well.
Whenever I'm watching these videos, it's like, how many times are they going to say bliet? I'm guessing more than twice.
Most likely. And let's see, this is a video of a saboteur in Ukraine who was caught. I don't know if the guy who caught him was like a National Guardsman or something, or territorial defense member, or if he was just a guy, but regardless, we have actual video of a saboteur being caught. Let's see. I already talked about that. Oh, so there was some guy who was talking about the perspective held by nationalists in Russia, because they kind of post online and talk amongst themselves and whatnot. So some observations that one analyst made is they kind of discount the possibility of an insurgency in Ukraine. They don't think it's likely. They think people will knuckle under relatively quickly. They admit that losses have been higher than expected, but they also think that doesn't change anything. They don't really care. They're expecting the Ukrainian identity to be suppressed. They think it's not a real identity and that they're just going to naturally assimilate into Russian identity over time.
They have their own language.
They see it as basically a dialect of Russian. So they don't think it's like a separate language. They think it's just like a sort of low culture version of Russian that's just going to naturally disappear with time.
My first thought was that would be like telling Texans that they're not actually Texan and how mad they would be. Oh boy.
Well, certainly people in Ukraine are upset.
Yeah.
But let's see, they also think that foreign support in the form of arms and supplies is going to be futile, that it's not going to change the outcome. And they also see sanctions as survivable. And some of the implications of the sanctions are even favorable, they think. They think that billionaires having to return to Russia is good, since it means they're not outside the reach of the Russian law. And they also think that there's going to be a manufacturing boom in Russia because of import substitution. They think they'll start having to produce their own stuff instead of importing so much, and that this will be good for the Russian manufacturing sector. So these are just different takes on Russian nationalist perspectives on the war thus far. And I think these are what, maybe from a week into the conflict or so, so they're maybe not the most up to date, but they just kind of illustrate that Russian nationalists are very much for the war. You know, they're very pro-war, and that some of the setbacks that they've encountered thus far are not really that substantive. They're not going to change their minds. Some interesting trivia I heard from Laserpig, who is a military commentator on YouTube, is that Russian transport planes operating in and around Ukraine are not turning off their transponders, such that you can actually see them on a radar tracking website, which is not all that substantive, but is humorous. That's the kind of operational security that you would think a first-rate military would observe, but apparently not. Let's see, city of Mariupol, which is currently under siege, has been cut off from electricity, heat, and fresh supplies of food. So there could be a pending humanitarian crisis there. I don't think that's happened in Kharkiv yet. I could be wrong. Chat, please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Uh, but Mariupol, I think, is the first major city to have public services substantially cut off. Also, there was a member of the OSCE, which is basically like a security organization. There was an OSCE special monitoring mission in Ukraine. Well, is a mission to Ukraine that is just observing the conflict. And the observer that they sent was killed in shelling in Kharkiv, which I thought was pretty substantive evidence just by itself that the Russians are in fact shelling Kharkiv. Let's see, I already mentioned that. Mentioned the drones. So some foreign policy implications. Supposedly, the United States is in talks right now with Venezuela over a possible resumption of oil imports. And supposedly, this could be a response to the increase in oil prices caused by the conflict in Ukraine, if not also the sanctions on Russian oil. So there could possibly be a rapprochement in the works between the United States and Venezuela as a result of this conflict. I don't know how far it'll go or even if this is a substantive report, but it does make some sense. Between Venezuela and a possible rapprochement with Iran as a result of a possible pending nuclear deal, which has been reported, by the way. Nobody's seen it in the news because it's been crowded out by drama in Ukraine, but there has been actual substantive progress on the nuclear deal with Iran. So if there could be a deal with Iran and a deal with Venezuela, that could help lower oil prices in the United States at least. And I did some Googling, and what I found is that US fracking is not going to really be able to help with oil prices until probably 2023. The 2020 bust from the collapse in oil prices on account of the pandemic wiped out a lot of fracking firms. There's been shortages in the industry of workers and specialized equipment, specifically pipes and specialized sand that's used in the production process. And investors have been pretty shy of putting money in oil stocks recently. So as a result, a lot of oil companies are not really putting as much money into investing in new projects, but rather are putting more back into things like dividends and stock buybacks in order to try to float the value of their stock. So overall, the situation is not very favorable for an immediate resumption of fracking oil production. I mean, it never stopped, but I mean a dramatic increase in production. That's probably not in the cards. There will be an increase in the long term, but right now it's just given all of the supply constraints and whatnot, it's going to take a while to get projects running. So that's not really going to be of big strategic help here in the short term.
And fracking isn't without its environmental problems either. So it's not necessarily a solution that everyone's going to be happy about.
Oh, yeah. That's been a part of the equation as well.
Hmm.
You know, the Biden administration had been pretty hostile in terms of its regulatory outlook on fracking operations and the oil industry generally. And so that alone was actually enough to cause investors to shy away from the industry, thereby inhibiting, further growth. But now that outlook has changed for obvious reasons, so as a result, there's relatively more investment than there was. So that's also been a factor. This is kind of silly, but I thought it was worth sharing because I thought you might appreciate it. This is oh, hang on. So this is a new patch that Ukraine's border patrol, which is apparently a thing, or road patrol, something like that. Basically, they have a new patch, and it's the Predator head from the movies. Let's see, and you'll appreciate this. These are some protesters. Oh, I don't remember the city. Actually, this is in Russia, right? So these are some Russian protesters who were harassing a policeman who was trying to arrest somebody. I don't know who he was trying to arrest, but they almost managed to free the guy before running off. But that illustrates that some of the protesters in Russia are getting a little bit bolder. Now, let's see. There was a peace rally in Kazakhstan, specifically the capital city of Almaty. It's notable that some of the major peace protests have actually been happening in places that are normally aligned more with Russia. So Georgia and Kazakhstan have been the particular examples that I've noted. I know some people are going to say Georgia isn't really aligned with Russia, but I would argue that they have been since the current president came to power. Maybe not as much as Kazakhstan or Armenia, I would grant that, but relatively aligned with Russia, let's say. Let's see. So I thought this was an interesting tactic. Apparently Ukraine has decided to flood some of the region around Kiev by draining part of the reservoir. There's a big reservoir north of Kiev. You can see it easily on any map. And apparently they're draining it in order to try to flood some of the surrounding area in order to make it impassable, or at least to make it harder to pass. That's going to worsen the mud that's sort of defining the region right now on account of the Rasputitsa. And this was a cute one from recently. This was some Russian troops who were trying to get to the roof of a building using an elevator, and the owner of the building shut off the power to the elevator, whereupon they were stuck. So we have pictures of that from the security camera in the elevator. So I thought that was pretty priceless as well. Let's see. Shell Company, quote unquote, made the difficult decision, end quote, to buy Russian oil. I think their justification is that there just wasn't any other source, that they basically just had to in order to meet demand. But a lot of people were obviously upset about it. I think they tried to kind of address the dislike, the PR damage by saying that all of the profits that they got from the sales would go to Ukrainian charities or to the Ukrainian government or some such. But regardless, that was, I thought, a kind of notable example of the kinds of pressure that companies are under. Let's see, there was some weirdness with the negotiating team. There's been two meetings now between negotiating teams for Russia and Ukraine as far as a possible ending of the war. And one of the guys that was on the Ukrainian team was a guy named Denis Kiriv. Kiriv, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. So he was reported to have been killed by Ukrainian intelligence for being a Russian spy and allegedly leaking information to the Russians, which is a pretty dramatic story in and of its own right. But then a day or two later, there was new information posted by the Ukrainian government saying that he had been killed in the line of duty as a double agent. So, in other words, he was a Ukrainian agent pretending to be a Russian agent. And apparently he was somehow killed by, I don't know, Russians or something. They didn't specify. So it could be that he was an agent for the Russians and the Ukrainian government reported it, but then tried to cover it up by releasing a news story that was more flattering to themselves. Having an agent infiltrate you like that is not a good look. But it could also just be that they didn't want to release the information that he was a double agent right away. Maybe there were some assets linked to him that needed time to escape to safety or something. I don't know. It's a super weird story, which is why I bring it up. It's just the kind of weirdness that has kind of come to define this conflict increasingly so. Let's see. And in Russia, there was a major supermarket chain that agreed to restrict the amount of food staples sold to each customer in an effort to limit hoarding. That was a report from the New York Times. So that illustrates that the Russian economy, as Neuro pointed out, is coming under increasing strain from sanctions. Whether or not this is a temporary measure or ends up being more of a permanent thing, I think is an open question. I would think it would be more temporary, since I imagine they can reorient their supply chain to make up for broken contracts and whatnot. Uh, but that remains to be seen. Certainly, it's going to be inconvenient in the short term. And then, as far as Russia losing access to Western markets, uh, I had one analyst in my Twitter feed suggest that, well, not my Twitter feed, rather, but I was reading one analyst's Twitter feed in which he argued that China would not by itself be able to compensate for the loss of the European market. China is a very large market in its own right, but they already do a lot of trade with them. And so there's not necessarily going to be a lot of room to increase that, either in terms of exports or imports. So it's definite losing access to Europe and the United States, among other countries that may cut off trade ties. That's definitely going to do some damage as far as Russian production and GDP. And this analyst also noted that even the stuff that's important and that they're nominally good at, like exporting energy, is going to be a bit hobbled because a lot of the infrastructure used to build it was built inefficiently on account of the Russian political economy being just sort of inherently parasitic and corrupt. Uh, the example that he gave is that the Power of Siberia pipeline that transmits gas from Russia to China was built in an inefficient way such that it costs much more, thereby maximizing the amount of money that could be pilfered by, corrupt relevant actors. And that kind of corruption just sort of permeates Russia's political economy. And so that's going to hobble any efforts they have to engage in import substitution to manufacture stuff they can't import anymore. And it's also going to hobble efforts to try to turn to China, so to speak, to try to replace European demand and supply. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of European technology makes it into Russia in the form of investment projects. So, like a lot of natural gas extraction and oil extraction is done using equipment imported from Germany in particular, among other Western sources. There are projects in Russia that use only Russian equipment, but from what I read, those projects have never actually been completed. They're still sort of in the planning stage. They seem to asymptotically approach completion, basically. Seemed to be the impression I got from this guy. So it doesn't seem likely that Russia will be able to easily replace European capital equipment, which is going to cause problems for them in the medium to long term as far as their dependence on energy exports, since production will slowly fall over time, kind of like it has in Venezuela or Iran for that matter. The lack of investment from the leading oil and gas companies has greatly inhibited their ability to continue to produce any substantive amounts of energy that they can export. So something similar could happen to Russia in the near to medium term. And this guy also pointed out that Russian oil is some of the most expensive in the world. They say that it costs about $42 for onshore, and that is to say per barrel. $42 in costs per barrel for onshore oil, and then $44 per barrel in costs for offshore projects. So they can still turn a profit on it for sure, but Saudi Arabia is way lower, for example. That's more like around $20 a barrel in costs. And it's true that the price of oil is really high right now on account of the global economic recovery from COVID and the pandemic and whatnot. But it's also true that having been cut off from a principal source of demand, Russian oil prices are below the mark, below global prices. I think right now they're like $7 below West Texas crude, which is sort of the global benchmark. And it seems like they're set to fall further. Whether or not they do is an open question. I know that Russia actually consumes most of their oil, so maybe it doesn't necessarily lower prices too much for them. But certainly it's not going to get higher. Let's see, I already mentioned the union protest. And this was just a quote that I liked. It was from, this is a quote from Lasia Vesyelenko, a Ukrainian member of parliament. And she was just posting on Twitter, reflecting about the war over the past week and a half or so. And she said, I quote, I still feel like I've been thrown into a parallel reality by some evil genius, and that my quiet, normal life is out there somewhere. I think many people around the world share the sentiment right now. And then one last thing before we go here. This was a video from a guy toasting the death of the stock market. This was on Reddit, so a lot of
Oh,
people.
this was good. I saw this.
Oh, you saw that? Okay.
You should still share it. I can show that on stream.
Yeah, it's in Discord there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Russian stock market has never been as deep. It's never had as much liquidity as other stock markets, so it's kind of always been more speculative in nature. It's not really been like a wellspring of capital, for companies looking to borrow money or to raise money rather. So it's not that big a deal that the stock market is kind of swirling the drain there. But it is definitely swirling. The valuations there have just plummeted. So it's not a great investment prospect at this point. And this guy, whom I assume is an investor or at least an analyst, had a rather humorous take on it. So I just thought that was cute.
Да, никто уже сейчас не говорит. Биржевые стратегии сегодня это вообще атовизм или вы еще надеетесь в профессии остаться?
So that's about all I had on
это раз в год только.
Ukraine.
He's gonna work as Santa Claus.
Yeah, the actual translation was not Santa Claus. The actual word or character he was referring to was something like Father Christmas, who was a figure in like Russian culture. But Santa is about as close an approximation as you can get as far as translation.
Флешмоб, не хочу, потому что я в это верить.
He refers to 12 or 13 years ago when it crashed before as well. So, pretty funny. The guy definitely has a sense of humor on a very bad day. And she's like,
oh, yeah. I love the look on her face.
She does a good job of saying what she's supposed to say in that situation, but you do have that little glimmer of like, oh shit.
Yeah, that was a good one. Let's see. I think we did have some questions. I think we got to most of them.
I was just reading questions from chat as we were going.
Yeah, but there were some from last week too that we didn't get to. But I don't know how much time we have for that.
Well, we're at 3 hours 12, so if you see any that jump out that you feel like you could tackle quickly, I'm fine with that.
Well, I will say that General Gerasimov was not fired, so that report was false. So that addresses one question anyway. But Wheel asked, what odds does he give that Putin is assassinated or replaced as this gets worse? Very, very low. There would, like I said earlier, there would have to be like a dramatic reversal. Like the Russian army would have to just be like stopped or defeated, or maybe the economy would just have to utterly implode. Something on that scale would be necessary before anybody even thought about it. And even then, I doubt anybody would really be brave enough to try. Let's see. We already talked about some of this stuff. Oh God, we'll save the Trump question for next time. That's a whole thing unto itself. I have not read Foundations of Geopolitics. I probably should. People keep recommending it and asking about it. Is it true that Chechen General Magomad Tusheyev was killed in Kiev? I don't know if it was Tusheyev, but I do know that there was a number of Chechens that were killed outside Kiev in an ambush. And supposedly one of the higher ranking guys was among them. Do I have any theories as to why in the world the Russians took Chernobyl? I mean, it was just in the way. Like the shortest distance between Belarus and Kiev is basically goes through Chernobyl. So that was just sort of a path of least resistance, you might say.
Был интересен. Покойся с миром, дорогой
Talked about
товарищ.
communication and structure.
Я не буду комментировать этот
Oh, shit talk between people and invading forces. Was this sort of thing common in other cultures? Sorry, other conflicts rather. Probably not. Kind of it kind of depends on the conflict. I mean,
Language barrier. For this one, basically all Ukrainians speak Russian, right?
yeah. for the
So
most
you,
part.
you can't talk shit if you don't speak the other language. So take an example of the US invading Iraq. If there's someone talking shit in a language that's not English, you can't really make any ground.
Yeah. Yeah, there's greater opportunity for it, you could say, in this
Yeah.
conflict. And in a lot of other conflicts, invaders have generally been much harsher to the conquered population.
Hmm.
So generally, they don't have the opportunity to shit talk, so to speak. As is, the Russians tried to justify this as a liberation of Ukraine. So they've been taking it relatively easier on the civilians thus far. We'll see how long that lasts, but at least for the moment, the protests have mostly gone unmolested in Ukraine. Let's see, and we kind of already addressed that as well. Yeah. And cities that are surrounded are not going to get supplied. The question was, how are they getting supplies when the cities are surrounded? They don't. They're just cut off. So at that, well, once a city gets surrounded, it's just a matter of time before, the defenders have to quit
But
just for lack of food.
Ukraine defends the western border toward Poland. So,
Yeah, it's
so-
on Poland's eastern border.
yeah, so Ukraine's west, Poland's east, so they can just use the roads there.
Yeah, that's a available avenue to get supplies into Ukraine as a whole. Yeah.
Mhm.
But individual cities, once they're surrounded, like Mariupol is just about surrounded if it isn't already, and then Sumy is also almost surrounded, and Chernihiv is about to be cut off, it seems.
Mhm.
So at that point, it's going to be just very difficult to get supplies in. So either you withdraw the forces defending them so you can preserve them, or you counterattack and try to cut off the forces that are about to surround you, or you just dig in and just try to fight as long as you can in order to inflict as much damage as you can.
Mhm.
Yeah, that war game I mentioned by the Marine Corps had the Ukraine player basically try to draw the Russian player into a prolonged fight for the city of Kharkiv. The way they put it, they wanted to drag the Russians into another Stalingrad in Kharkiv.
Mhm.
And that involved basically not being very proactive and attacking much. It basically involved taking on a defensive stance and trying to draw the Russians closer into the city. And thus far, that's kind of actually what we've seen in the war thus far. Uh, the Ukrainians are not really attacking the Russians all that much around Kharkiv. There was that counteroffensive recently, but otherwise they've been basically just trying to draw the Russians into a protracted battle for the city that will ideally drain them over time.
Yep, playing really defensive makes sense when you don't need to go places. The conflict is coming to you, so if you can fortify your position, force them to take a really cost-ineffective trade, then over time they could just run out of energy.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's going to be one of the disadvantages that Ukraine has as we kind of enter the middle stage of the conflict. The supply line to the west is invariably going to be threatened at some point, and that's going to significantly curtail their ability to resist. So once that point is reached, the tenor of the conflict the tenor and pace of the conflict is most likely going to change pretty dramatically. That's all I had.
Well, cool. Appreciate you helping break that down. We had a funny question at the very start, actually before we got started, of what is going to be the main topic for today. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The main topic was the crisis in Ukraine. I bet many people could have guessed that, but courage and strength to the Ukrainian people. Again, for anyone who's listening in or watching this as a video, there was so much that we covered. It's likely that we made a few errors here and there. So if you have any corrections for us, feel free to share in the comments. And if you have any personal perspective, either if you are in Ukraine or in Russia, about what your experience is like, we welcome that information, that feedback, because we're really just two people here trying to figure out what is going on. And your input is really appreciated. And thank you, Agent Smith, for helping break things down. I'll try to give you guys an update on Bitter Sugar as he gives them to us. I think it's late night, early morning there. But we have one of our friends who is over there in Kyiv right now.
Thank you for allowing me the opportunity. It's always a privilege. And I know a lot of the information I've given is speculative. But, you know, I don't know, like, how else to kind of approach it. I don't have a whole lot of verified information to work with. So the approach I'm taking is to basically do the online equivalent of a literature review, a kind of Twitter literature review, looking at what all the analysts who are observing the conflict are talking about and trying to kind of convey that information to try to give you an impression of what the expectations are and, in general, a rough outline of what's happening and what is thought to be happening.
Fog of war is thick. It's tough to figure things out. Appreciate your effort in compiling all this stuff and giving us some input.
Yeah. I do try. And hopefully it's useful to somebody. But yeah, thanks again. Try again next week.
Heck yeah, sir. People were really hyped. Just as a reference, I was doing StarCraft just laddering on my own, and then when we flipped over to Agent Smith, the viewership ramped right up. So I think there were a lot of people who are really keen for this segment, especially in current times. As though biased we are, we're not perfect. We try to give you a fair take at what's going on. So thank you, Mr. Agent Smith, for coming on for another episode of World Discussion this March the 6th.
Yep. Thanks again. See you next time.
GG.